Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another New Jersey Constitutional Republicans Virtual Conversation. It's my great pleasure to have once again joining us tonight, Dr. James Lindsay. James, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Now, in case you haven't heard of Dr. James Lindsay, which I find it remarkable that you have not, because he is all over. And we're going to show some the YouTube. If you type in James Lindsay in YouTube, we're going to show all of the videos and all of the time that he gives to so many people in getting this message out. But before we get started, we have a PowerPoint presentation that we're going to do that's going to focus on James's website, Newdiscourses, which is loaded with information. And of course, his brand new book, Race Marxism, which is been out over a little over a month now, James, and it's a fascinating and very important read for everyone out there to get their hands on. It's a very thorough study. But James, before we get started, just tell the people who may not know of you, there's one or two out there who are listening and watching right now who've never heard of James Lindsay before. Just give us a little bit of a bio, a little background.
So like you said, I run Newdiscourses. Newdiscourses, the website is newdiscourses.com. It exists to put out as much information about the so-called woke ideology or woke Marxist ideology as can be done. My basic day job is to read Marxism and tell people about it. This is more or less all I do.
Yeah.
I've been trying to do kind of a research study on how Marxism evolved from Karl Marx through what we see in the woke movement today, because it's changed quite a lot. My background is in mathematics. I have a PhD in math that I earned getting on 12 years ago. I don't do math professionally anymore, but I think it tooled my brain to study this stuff pretty well. And so that's more or less who I am and what I do. I guess a few years ago, some people might have heard I did the Grievance Studies Affair, or I participated in that. We wrote a number of fake academic articles to show that what was going on in academia with the peer review system is easily captured by a political ideology. And in fact, it has been captured by that. So, some people will have heard of those fake academic articles from 2018. And that was a project spearheaded by myself. Since then, I wrote a book called Cynical Theories, and now you've mentioned Race Marxism, where I try to expose this ideology for what it is and try to explain where it came from and why it thinks the way that it thinks.
Right, and of course, you co-authored Cynical Theories with Helen Pluckrose, who has some fine videos and is an excellent teacher herself. But let's get right into this presentation, James. We've got a lot to cover. And of course, here we're starting with the book. Can you see that, James?
I can.
Very good. Okay, good. We have you up there. And there it is. And you can order this book, which is what you're going to want to do, especially after hearing this presentation. This is essentially part one of a two-part series. And James has a very busy schedule. We hope to have him back in with us in a couple of weeks or a month to finish this up, because we're just scratching the surface, but we are getting halfway through this book, and you can get it at racemarxism.com. And I will provide this PowerPoint presentation to anyone who's interested in having it and learning from it. Now, let's give a little bit of history, James. Prior to your hard work, and you have made this your life's mission in getting this information out there. And it's not only about critical theory, it's about cultural Marxism, it's about critical race theory, it's about postmodernity, and there's so much more to it. And that's why it's a relatively complicated subject, but you've dedicated your time and your life essentially to this. But prior to this, James, we were talking about cultural Marxism 7 or 8 years ago. And at that time, the only media sources we had were William Lind, who you can see on the YouTube, The Origins of Cultural Marxism, a documentary made by James Jagger called Cultural Marxism, The Corruption of America, that included Ron Paul and Edwin Vieira and Pat Buchanan, who you're familiar with, our audience would be familiar with. And I remember, James, back in 1992 when Pat Buchanan during the Republican National Convention that nominated George H.W. Bush for president, and he was runner-up, and he said that America is engaged in a cultural war. And that was surprised a lot of people, and it's one of the most famous things he's ever said. He's also said that the Marxists, or that we defeated the Marxists during the Cold War, but the Marxists have won the cultural war. That's what we'll be talking about tonight. And then we have the Devil's Pleasure Palace by Michael Walsh, and a lecture by Professor Fry at Yale. And that was essentially it, James, until you came along. And what's amazing, James, is that there are people that actually deny that cultural Marxism exists. How's that possible?
Well, it's a funny little story. It turns out a few years ago, I was just kind of dipping my toes into this. And so I looked up the term cultural Marxism for the first time. This would have been 3 or 4 years ago during those grievance studies papers. And there was a great Wikipedia article at the time about cultural Marxism. And they said, well, it's basically the idea that we're going to apply Marxist analysis to cultural underpinnings that uphold capitalist society, so that you can do as Antonio Gramsci, who's pictured down there, I think in the lower right-hand corner, as he suggested, that you're going to infiltrate into the various cultural institutions like religion, family, education, media, law. We might add, just the entertainment complex. Today, we might definitely want to add medicine, these cultural institutions that keep things going. And we're going to turn them Marxist from within over a very long period of time, over generations. And then when the moment is right, when the culture is degraded and has been softened up to Marxism, then we'll have a revolution. And then if you go further down, near the bottom, there was a section that said, well, there's also a conspiracy theory that some right-wing reactionaries have cooked up the idea that because the Frankfurt School guys were all Jewish, and they were, or at least nominally Jewish, they were not religiously Jewish, so there is some distinction, that they had a plot to undermine Western civilization. So there's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory called cultural Marxism, that a group of nefarious Jews want to undermine Western civilization. And then a few years later, I suddenly discovered, this would be about a year and a half ago now, I suddenly discovered that the kind of useful Wikipedia entry on cultural Marxism had been replaced by a new entry that just says cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. And all they've done is explained the last piece, which was that there is a conspiracy theory attached to this. And in fact, that it is in some ways anti-Semitic. So the way that it is that the people who don't want people to realize that we are undergoing a cultural revolution led by cultural Marxists have tried to bury the fact. They have made it out that the kind of reactionary, overread explanation of what this cultural Marxist phenomenon is the only true one, so that it would dissuade people from thinking that the Frankfurt School really did have a intention to undermine Western civilization from within and to install Marxism as a result, which turns out to be completely true. It also turns out to be completely irrelevant to the fact that they were Jewish. It turns out to be completely relevant to the fact that they were communists. And those two things are not the same, as anyone that spends 5 minutes reading about any of this would readily know. Marx railed on the Jews. He, in fact, was not. It's a big misbelief. People believe Marx was Jewish because his family line was Jewish, but Marx, in fact, his parents were Lutheran. He wrote a vigorously anti-Semitic essay on the Jewish question himself. And so you actually had a number of people who happened to be Jewish who were, more importantly, communist, who wanted to have a communist revolution. And so the normal obfuscations and distortions have filled that in. So that's kind of how, but communists want to cover their tracks. They depend on stealth. They depend on being able to quietly and secretly infiltrate the institutions till they gain enough power to where they can't be opposed till it's too late. And then they snap the trap. And that's what they're attempting to do now. And that's why they've hidden this, so that people wouldn't be as able to see it when people, like on the previous slide and like Andrew Breitbart and so on, started talking about this, a decade ago or a little over a decade ago.
Right. And James, I have to tell you that we see Jordan Peterson there in the picture, but Mr. Bastani certainly should have ingratiated your image on there as well, because it definitely should be on there.
No, thank you.
And here we go with New Discourses. What a wonderful site, James, you put together here. And it's loaded with information. We're going to begin to look at it. Newdiscourses.com. And there are several headings that we're going to look into. And this is very, very important. One of the great aspects of this website is what you've done with translations from the Wokish, which is a plain language encyclopedia of social justice terminology. And of course, here's some of the information that you go in. If you hit the about translations from the Wokish, this information comes up. And Jim, just flesh out a little bit why this is so important and such a very important piece of newdiscourses.com.
Yeah, so something that a lot of people don't understand, it's very important. This is a very easy maxim to remember, and it's true, but we've forgotten it. It used to be something people would say is that communists or Marxists, if you want, share your vocabulary, but they don't share your dictionary. So what that means is they use words that you use, like maybe in today's parlance, diversity, inclusion, even democracy, but they use them in a specialized way that in virtually every case means communism. And so if you don't understand that they are deliberately misusing language, that they've created very specific redefinitions of terms, and then everyday terms, and then that they misuse those, you can't understand what they say or what they write. So you can read their writing that they've written themselves. You can hear things that they say themselves and not understand what they mean by it. So I thought it was very important to start breaking down the misuses of language. Essentially, this goes back a step further philosophically, is that they actually have a completely different conception of the world and how the world works. And from that, they believe that words must mean something different if you actually understand the reality of how the world works. So just to give you an example, the word democracy is a good one to dive into just very briefly. Democracy in the language of Marxists means when you have a democratic system applied within communism. And so you have to have the communism first, or democracy is not possible. They actually call it proletarian democracy. And the reason you have to have communism first is because if you have more money than I do, or you have more privilege than I do, or you have more opportunity than I do, then you and I don't have equal voice. So we don't have a true democracy. We only have a true democracy when everybody's made all the way equal first. So true democracy only exists in socialism and communism under the Marxist definition of democracy. And even basic words like truth and knowledge, they have completely different definitions of those. You can look on, for example, you can look at my encyclopedia, but you can also go on Marxists.org. They have a wonderful encyclopedia and glossary on their own website. And if you look up their definition of truth, for example, and it's very easily found. Just type in Marxists.org definition truth, and in the search engine, you can find it very quickly. And they tell you explicitly right there that what they mean by truth, they say there are many theories of truth. Most of them have something to do with when an idea corresponds to the real world. But what Marxists mean by truth is that it's a social formation. And in fact, it's closest to the pragmatist definition of truth, which means whatever works is true, except that it must be rooted in Marxist theory. So the definition of truth in Marxism is Marxism. Marxism is true, everything else is false. And they tell you right there that they mean something completely different by the word truth than what everybody else means by it.
That's right. And you'll see the alphabetical listing of all the many words that James has put up there. And here's one word, James, that we looked up, privilege. I was looking at white privilege, and you'll give the social justice usage here on the left, and then you have your commentary, New Discourses commentary on the right. And this is what you do with each one of these words. So, and you're using sources that are advocates of the social justice agenda.
That's right.
And then you're giving a clear commentary.
That's right.
So this is very, very useful. Very, very useful. And of course, we hear the word white privilege and privilege. I'm going to show you a video a little bit later where our governor of New Jersey actually used it in the debate, James, in his debate, the gubernatorial debate. So this is a debate. This is a word that is used and is often exploited. And you also have videos, James, that you've begun to put out, which are short 2-minute snippets. Here's an example of one of those videos, and the word that you're translating for us is decolonize. And so that's very useful too. And you can find this also on New Discourses and on the YouTube channel, correct?
That's right. Yeah. I'm telling you, they misuse all these words all over the place.
We have to decolonize everything. We have to decolonize.
And there he is. I'm sorry, James, go ahead.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I want people to understand that they share your vocabulary. You understand the word decolonize to some degree, just hearing it, because it means, well, there's been colonizing and we must take that away. But then they have a very specific meaning. They have a different dictionary meaning for it that's caught up, and they have a different program. What I also say, so that's a famous maxim, the communists share your vocabulary, but not your dictionary. One that I often say is that every woke word conceals an agenda. They have a political agenda with these words. So when you say that you have the gubernatorial candidate bringing that word up, whether that candidate knows it or not, he's forwarding a political agenda by bringing that word up because it's tucked within that word. So privilege, actually, we just saw a moment ago as an example, privilege actually refers to the state of being a member of the bourgeois class of society in the Marxist bourgeois versus proletariat class antagonism. And so if he starts talking about some people have privilege and we have to acknowledge privilege, what he's saying is some people have bourgeois values and have to acknowledge their bourgeois values. And you just see then that it's a perfect reproduction of Leninism, for example. And sadly, the gubernatorial candidate may or may not know that he's facilitating that political agenda because it's hidden within this disguising language. And so that's why I made these videos, and that's why I made that encyclopedia.
Right. And James, very quickly before we move on, and we'll elaborate this more, I believe, in part 2, and that is the influence of Jacques Derrida and the postmodern idea of language. Doesn't that have a correlation? Isn't that an influence on how these words are manipulated by the left?
That's a significant influence. Yeah, Derrida's deconstructive language project was actually very significant in that regard. But in fact, he got that idea from looking at so Derrida we see as a postmodernist, but he was more technically, and I know this is splitting hairs, a post-structuralist. And I only bring that up because that means that he was reacting to the movement in French thought called structuralism. And structuralism was, in fact, kind of a view that language constructs reality in a particular way. And it actually looked at things in a way that had to do with, it had many Marxist roots, basically. So Derrida was saying, well, we have to look at the way that words construct meaning and the words relate to one another. And so after Derrida, what you find is a great deal of desire to play around with words and screw around with meaning and hide new meanings. It also has to do just with the entire Marxist program, especially as it evolved through the 20th century. And because of, the reaction in America, particularly against communism, they had to hide what they were doing. If they were communist, they had to tuck it underneath layers of confusing language. And so you can find this in the older kind of neo-Marxist or critical Marxist tradition as well. And like I said, it goes back to a deeper root behind Derrida, behind any of these guys in the 20th century. And that deeper root is that they believe the world works in a fundamentally different way than it actually does. They have a pretend constructed reality, and the words that they use describe what's going on in the Marxist interpretation of reality, assuming that it's true while ignoring the actual reality that we all inhabit and that we create words to try to communicate with one another about. And so, yes, and so there's more to it than just Derrida, but Derrida really opened up the floodgates of being able to play with language. In fact, he called it play, to play with language in order to do political activism.
And also we have the New Discourses podcast, James, which are a whole collection of incredibly informative information. They're normally about an hour long. Here's one that's critical race theory is Race Marxism. They're put together so very well. You really do have a good staff of musicians and graphic artists working with you, James, with these podcasts. And they're really well put together and they're loaded with information. And James, I play him so much that my wife hears him in the house and she's calling you by your first name, James. Now she says, I hear James' voice in the background. So she's getting familiar with these podcasts as well. But the people need to go and look at these podcasts on New Discourses. And we're going to highlight, we're going to touch upon a few of these. But we also have the only subs category, James, and I'm proud to be considered a subscriber through YouTube. You see the different means by which and resources that you can become a member to receive these only subs broadcasts. Locals, Patreon, Subscribestar, YouTube members, and thanks, Bob. And James just released another only subs of wokeness as an insurgency, which we'll talk about a little bit probably in part 2. But James, the only subs opportunity you've given us is really outstanding. And again, the amount of material that you put out is incredible.
Thanks.
And you're working very hard at it. And we really appreciate the effort. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'll tell you, I've just started, I haven't released any yet, but I've started a third podcast series too, which I'm going to call New Discourses Bullets. You're actually the first person I've told this about, or two. And
Great.
So the idea will be, so the New Discourses podcast, which we discussed a moment ago, is my long form deep diving exploration. Some of them are, I try to hopefully shoot for about an hour, but some of them are 2, some of them are 3, one of them is 4 hours long, where I really deep dive into various subjects. I read their literature and interpret it in real time with you. And then the only subs I created as saying thank you to the people who subscribe to me. So I wanted to create a shorter, more casual, kind of my wilder thoughts podcast and put that out there. And I just decided to make it as a gift to my subscriber base. I give them kind of secret, special material that nobody else can just get. Yeah. And it's like I said, it's casual, it's shorter form. This New Discourses Bullets is going to be, actually, I thought of it when I was in the Oklahoma State House recently, and I was talking to policymakers and the governor's cabinet there and some other people. And I realized policymakers don't have an hour and a half, 2 hours to listen to these podcasts all the time, but they need to understand these concepts. And so I'm trying to keep these between 8 and 12 minutes each. And so just a quick I call them bullets because it's bullet point style. This is what you need to know. This is what diversity, equity, and inclusion means in practice. 10 minutes, go. And so the goal is to have these, they won't be hidden behind a paywall. They'll be public. And the goal is to really create something quick and shareable that people like policymakers in particular, or people who are busy and activists who want to, take on school boards or whatever else, where they can digest this, CEOs can digest this material very quickly in shorter form. So I've got a new product coming on New Discourses soon too.
Well, that's great news, James. I'm glad you shared it with us first, but I want to admonish the audience to please support James and sign up as an Only Subs member. He's doing this full time, and he's making a great difference throughout the nation. People are learning more about critical theory. And fortunately, James, there are many people now that are motivated to run for school board positions and to get involved in making sure that, and we'll talk more about education later, but, and here it is, critical education theory, perfect segue. And here's another category on the New Discourses webpage. And we're going to be getting into some heavy duty discussion about what is going on in our schools and the indoctrination that's going on with our children. But again, James, this is a very, very important aspect of what you're providing on New Discourses.
Yeah, that episode that you actually have on the screen right here is the 4 hour and 15-minute episode, as it turns out. I
thought that was the Hegel.
No, that one's only 3 hours and 45 or something. So this one's the longest, the one that's on the screen.
Great one, though.
What I actually did in this podcast was I read a key paper in what's called Transformative Social and Emotional Learning all the way through, and explained line by line that what this is a vehicle to put Marxism into the kids, into the school, to program kids with Marxism. And I explain how it works. I explain where it came from in using their own words. And I also show how in that paper that they explain that social emotional learning used to be something, this is a very tricky, hijacking of language. It used to be a program that worked, and it was a program under the umbrella of personal responsibility. They taught
Mhm.
kids who had issues with social and emotional problems how to take responsibility for those, how to cope with those problems, and how to get back into the classroom and make academic success. And it worked. And then they say, well, we changed it to a participatory model, which started to bring in some civic engagement, which was done under a Marxist lens. And now they've switched it over in the last 2 years to this transformative social emotional learning, which is purely about raising a Marxist consciousness in children and using psychological manipulations to do it. And so you can actually follow in this podcast, for example, how they have retooled education to be a Marxist programming session. And this series, the critical education theory series, is actually going to end up, I don't know how many, 50 probably podcasts. I recorded 2 more yesterday for it. It's already, I don't know, 8 or 9 deep or 10 deep. I'm going to really do this deep dive on education so that all these people fighting for the schools, fighting for their kids, which is basically the most important thing in the world, can have the information they need to know what's actually captured education, so they can understand why it's important to take it on and how to take it on, to try to get it out and protect our children and rescue our republic. Because if we don't have an educated populace, our republic is going to fall apart. If we have a Marxist indoctrinated republic, we don't have a republic. We're in big trouble. So I consider this to be extremely important. As I've kind of transitioned, I think I've said what needs to be said about critical race theory, with race Marxism in particular. And so now I'm trying to tackle the critical education theory side.
That's right. And the next time we get together, we're going to discuss people like Georgy Lukács, who many of the people are going to be just shocked at his philosophy and the influence that he had in the Belarusian government.
That's right.
Of course, now we're good, right, James? So we'll talk about that later, but we got to get through this slideshow. We get through the first 2 chapters of the book, but I want to highlight a couple of the New Discourses podcasts. This is actually the first one, James, that you put up. And it was a speech that you gave at the National Liberal Club in the Gladstone Library in London, England. This is really the first salvo that you did via video, correct?
That's right. And if I might, polish my nails a little bit here, that place where you see me standing exactly right there, giving my first major public talk on this issue, is exactly the same spot where Winston Churchill gave his first public talk before he became prime minister, before World War II.
Fascinating. And of course, you describe social justice is a critical method and comes in a pretty box, as you say, that is in respecting people apparently and making the world fair, yet what is inside is not as pretty.
No, it's Marxism. It's communism dressed up in a pretty bow is what it is.
And we discussed, we're going to look at a couple of slides from Robin Dangelo, who's a name that you're going to hear quite about, and of course, Max Horkheimer. And Robin Dangelo, James wrote a book called Everyone is Really Equal, right?
I have the book right here, right by me.
And you know this book probably better than she does.
That's a mess.
But this book really is one of the very, very important books of the current modern day woke. And she's been very influential, James, in educational programs, collegiate educational programs. And her book was freely given to school administrators.
That's right. That's right. And she's been very influential primarily in the realm of education and in the realm of human resources or HR development. And she's made gobs and gobs and gobs of money with her very busy speaking and appearance schedule and off of these books that you have here on the screen, each of which is its own kind of interesting disaster if you want to read them. I really encourage people to read Robin Dangelo. I used to say that she was the greatest gift to people who want to understand wokeness because she just puts it out there so clearly and so plainly. And I think it's very important. White Fragility has a shocking chapter. I mean, the whole book is shocking, but it has a chapter 11. It's very shocking where she characterizes the idea of white women crying. The chapter is literally about what she calls white women's tears, which is in the encyclopedia we talked about earlier. She says, when white women cry, it's a political act, and it's a form of racism. So if a white woman becomes upset, that's a form of her doing racist politics. And specifically, she's saying if you call her a racist and she gets upset and starts to believe it and starts to cry, that she's actually trying to get out of dealing with her racism and wants to cry and be coddled instead. It's really kind of psychotic and abusive when you read that. In fact, I did a spoof of that specific chapter. I took the chapter, and very few people know I did this because I didn't do it under my own name, but I did tell people. I took out where it says tears and replaced it with suicide and made all the words work. So white women killing themselves is just a way for them to try to get attention and deflect from racism. And it was horrifying to read, but I had to change probably no more than, 50 or 60 words in the entire chapter, and it just works. That's how sadistic it is. It's really, the woman is not well.
And now we're going to talk about a couple of quotes, James, from the book, tying the modern day theory that Robin Dangelo holds with the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. And she says that, quote, a critical approach to social justice refers to specific theoretical perspectives that recognize that society is stratified, i.e. divided in unequal and significant and far-reaching ways along social group lines that include race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability. Critical social justice recognizes inequality is deeply embedded in the fabric of society, that is structural, and actively seeks to change this. The definition we aptly is rooted in a critical theoretical approach. So there it is, James.
Yeah, she doesn't hide it. It's right there. This is neo-Marxism, or critical Marxism, as some other scholars call it, reinvented using identity politics. She's very, very clear. That's what's actually going on here. It's right there in the middle of that quote. We're using at the top quote. She says the Frankfurt School Institute for Social Research, which, by the way, that's the School of Critical Theory. Its original name, before its funders said that's going to not work if we call it that, was the Institute for Marxism at Frankfurt, at Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany. And so it was the Institute for Marxism. They said change the name, Institute for Social Research. And then, so you see that it's critical Marxism. And then the next paragraph that you have here, this next quote right there, it's all, the stratification is not about economic class now. It's about many more: race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability. And so what she calls critical social justice, which she goes into very much detail at the very beginning of this book to explain critical social justice is not the same thing as actual social justice. She says that it uses critical theory as the means, is spread out to use all of these different identity factors to claim society is stratified according to them by power dynamics, structural power dynamics that are part of how society is organized, the fundamental organizing principles, the fabric of society, as she says, and that what you have to do is use Marxist theory to understand and thus to change that state of affairs. It's very explicit.
And here's the tie-in, James, with the Frankfurt School and one Max Horkheimer. What's interesting too, James, is that Columbia University invited this think tank to set up shop there.
That's right. That's exactly what happened. And that was probably done through the bankrolling and facilitation of the Fabian Society in London. In 1933, Hitler claimed the chancellorship of Germany. Obviously, that was not going to be a great circumstance for Jews. It was also not going to be a great circumstance for Marxists. Anybody who's read Mein Kampf, which I do recommend people do, you shouldn't shy away from understanding the worst turns that history has made. And in this case, we have the good fortune that the author of that dark hour of our history wrote down his manifesto before he did it. And so you have it there. And what you find is the first several chapters, all he does is talk about how much he hates the Marxists. He hates the Marxists. He hates the Marxists. Then he eventually hits a part in the second or third chapter, I don't remember exactly where he says, one day I finally realized they're all Jews. And that's where you see where all that went. And these guys were by family and nominally Jewish, and they were definitely Marxists running the Institute for Marxism in Frankfurt. So Hitler claims a chancellorship. They skedaddle out of town to Geneva for a little under a year, and with the help of the Fabian Society in London, which is a gradualist socialist society that was set up there. It runs a London School of Economics, for example, and its deep ties into the British Labour Party. They were brought over to American universities, in particular at first Columbia, but also including Brandeis, Berkeley, UCSD, and UCLA. Probably several more in New England, but I don't want to overstate these things. But yeah, definitely they were brought over very intentionally. Columbia University was kind of the epicenter of that. And Horkheimer, you can see Horkheimer was a gnarly fella. He was reconstituting Marxism intentionally to overcome a fact about Marxism that he said Marx overlooked, which is that capitalism actually works. And so he said that the critical theory came into existence specifically to deal with the fact that what was happening was that the middle class was stabilizing the working class. The workers were making enough money to have a life that they were proud of and happy with. And so they weren't revolutionaries anymore. And so what he said is the very language of the society that we live in, and that's what we were talking about with the encyclopedia earlier, is caught up in the reproduction of the existing society, which is capitalist and oppressive, et cetera. So what you have to do is have a total break from that. And so he devised a thing called critical theory that is supposed to actually do that. And so what you see, it says, it has to identify what is wrong with the current social reality, identify the people and actors that can change it, and then actually inspire that activism. What he's actually saying there, and the exact quote from a thing he put out in 1969 in an interview or a speech, was that he said that what he realized when creating the critical theory is that you can't understand or even envision or describe a good society in the language of the existing society. So he created a new way to do Marx's idea, which was that we study society in order to change it, not just to understand it. And what he realized was that what we can do, we can't describe a good society with a critical. So what we're going to have is a critical theory where we can criticize the negative aspects of what we have to cause people to be discontented with it and alienated from it and want to rise up and overthrow it. And so this is a nasty character right here. And so you see, he summarized here from a source from 1972, which would be very near when he died. He actually named critical theory for the first time in 1937 in an essay called Traditional and Critical Theory, which describes exactly what we're looking at here, and which retooled Marxism in the Western context and for the center part of the 20th century, a completely new vein. And that's what this guy right here is, what Robin Dangelo was explicitly, and in the book, she uses his name, explicitly referring to as the basis for her line of thought.
That's right, James. And we have to put in bold letters, emphasis on the word critical. Criticize, criticize, criticize all that we consider to be good or wholesome or traditionally liberal and freedom loving. And that's exactly what they do in this methodology. And this is really a foundational, these three foundations. And of course, you have the idea of praxis that you talk about quite a bit. The advocating the very theory itself. So it's all
Marx
right there.
actually said, he said that Marx said that his method, his critique, is ruthless criticism of all that exists.
There you go.
Ruthless criticism, not fair criticism, not reasonable criticism, ruthless criticism of everything that exists.
Yeah, that's an excellent quote, one that we need to remember. Now, this is another, what I thought was very interesting podcast, James, is why professors fear to live stream critical social justice class. And you've already talked about one aspect of subversion and camouflage and keeping things under wraps. That's just one aspect. Can you speak to that a little bit? And you also identified two other important proponents of woke ideology, Allison Bailey and Barbara Applebaum.
Yeah, those are two very important characters, but this is the main thing. Now, there is a reason why. I mean, having been an instructor myself, there are various reasons why you might be uncomfortable, having videos of all of your classes out there. This podcast was released in the context of the pandemic and everything being done virtually and remotely, and there being this kind of debate about it. And I understand. So I actually go into that, and then I discuss it because, you develop rapport with your class, you say things kind of off the cuff, maybe you misspeak, and somebody might clip that out of context and make a bunch of hay out of it when it's, unfair. And I understand that. But on the other hand, what you find with the Marxists in general, and what I keep finding again and again, is that in writing, they're very clear about what they mean once you know how to read their words. But when they start talking about it, they get very slippery. They don't want people to see what they're saying because I think it makes it more believable. And when you look at it in print, it's sometimes very difficult to understand. So they want to keep it under wraps. They don't want to be watched. They don't want people to see that they are actually using that they're actually using class time to teach Marxist ideology. And, for example, if it's a mathematics lesson, that maybe they're misteaching mathematics so that they or replacing actual mathematics instruction with Marxist indoctrination instruction. So they don't want to do that. And what you see from both of these characters, Alison Bailey and Barbara Applebaum, is that they believe that any pushback against them is illegitimate. And so what that would open the door to is a lot more illegitimate criticism. So Alison Bailey's concept, for example, here of privilege preserving epistemic pushback, she says that this is a way that people want to preserve their privilege. So when they encounter these social justice or woke Marxist ideas, they reject them. And it can't possibly be because the ideas are wrong. It's because they're trying to maintain their privilege. By the way, at the time when I made this podcast, I didn't realize, but this is just recreating Marx's view of ideology. That the people who had the ideologists, as Marx called them, but the people who have access to the superstructural strata of society are just giving, they're making, as it says here, a variety of willful ignorance that members of dominant groups give so that they are able to keep their positions of power and privilege to justify why they get to be special. Barbara Applebaum's even wilder. That book, Being White, Being Good, is actually a very shocking book. And she actually argues in that book, and somewhere in page 54, 6-ish, somewhere in the mid 50s page number, can't remember the exact citation, but she actually argues that there's only one legitimate way to disagree, which is to ask questions for clarification until you agree, which isn't disagreeing at all. So their assumption is that there's no legitimate disagreement with what they're doing, but if this were to be put out there, then there would be lots of illegitimate disagreeing with what they're doing and saying. And they don't want to have to be buried in that, what they would consider illegitimate disagreement. And so they don't want people to see what they're doing, which is a bit strange because, like I said, they put it out in writing voluminously, copiously, proudly. I just read a paper about education in private schools that was published this year, where the scholar is literally quoting Lenin. And they're unabashed in writing, but they don't want anybody to see it out loud for some set of reasons that still escapes me a little bit. I think because it becomes believable. When you see it in writing, it seems abstract, something like this. But they don't want to be seen because they think that all pushback is illegitimate, and those two characters really show you that.
Now, here was a fascinating article, and of course, I want to go over further articles later on in future engagements with you, James. But here's an article entitled "A Virus: Critical Theories, a Virus on Liberal Body Politic." So describe for us how the virus and critical theories are synonymous.
It's really bad to characterize your opponent as something nasty like a virus, and it sounds like something that you wouldn't want to do. But as you have here on the screen, Women's Studies as a Virus, Institutional Feminism, Affect, and the Projection of Danger by Brianne Foss and Michael Karger, who are both professors at Arizona State University, which, by the way, I was at Arizona. I gave a talk at Arizona State University 2 days ago. These guys wrote a paper saying that they're proud to think of themselves as viruses. And they explain that what they do is that they bring this ideology into a college program. They specifically mention biology. So you have a student who majors in biology, they describe, and they specifically name a male student. And then the male student takes a few women's studies classes, maybe because they're required, or mandatory diversity, equity, inclusion classes or whatever. And they take these classes and they get infected with the ideology. And then they go off to grad school and they join a new department at another school, or they get a job and they work at a laboratory or a company or whatever it happens to be. And then they inject those values into the company or the new department or whatever it is. So they catch the virus and then carry the virus to another department. And that's, they say, the ideal metaphor to describe the way that they're actually trying to do it. It says right here, it is a future pedagogical priority for these approaches to studying to serve as symbolic viruses. And like you said, this is in their own words. They compare themselves to Ebola, HIV. They also compare themselves to SARS and to cancer. And they say that cancer represents true transformative change, permanent change. And so some viruses give people cancer, like HPV is known to cause cervical cancer, for example, in women. And so they give that example, and then they say, well, we want to be like that because if it gives you cancer, that's permanent change. And that's what we're really looking for, is to transform society. So their mechanism is to figure out a way to attach to students, to inject their ideological protein into the cell of the student or a department, and then to have that infected cell then go out and reproduce the ideology and infect other cells. That's literally the way they characterize themselves. And so when you understand that they characterize themselves as a virus, it's a bit shocking. It's hard to come back from that. You can very easily explain, well, their methodology is to work like viruses that are coming in and changing the DNA of the cell that they infect so that they can reproduce themselves. This, by the way, is just a repackaging. We mentioned Antonio Gramsci earlier, the cultural Marxist from the 1910s through the 30s. Antonio Gramsci said, this is how you do it. This is what you do. You infect cultural institutions that have a cultural hegemony, and you get inside of them with infiltrators, and you create a counter hegemony within the institution and spread it virally. He doesn't say virally, but he says you spread it from one institution to the next. They are just repackaging the Gramscian model using the metaphor of the virus as the thing that they want to use to characterize it. And like I said, I was just at Arizona State. I did not see either of these two fine individuals while I was there, but I did mention them in the talk I gave, and I did mention this paper. So you see what their goal, though, what is it for? To infect, unsettle, and disrupt traditional and entrenched fields. That's what their objective is. That's how they characterize themselves. And I think it's very important for people to realize that. They even say in the paper that conservatives are like the immune system, so it needs to be suppressed. And that's why they mention HIV, which is, an immunosuppressing virus.
Well, they certainly should have came and hear you speak when you were there just a few days ago, James. Now, this is going to be very important because there's a lot of people who have heard of what they call DEI. And before we get to that, James, I just want to show you something here, quick, just very, very quickly. Let's see here. Should be right. No, this is while we're here. Just let me show. If you do a type in James Lindsay, type his name in on YouTube, you'll see all of these different. You can see, James, I was looking at Hegel wokeness and the dialectical faith of leftism. You see that?
Yeah.
I listen to that quite often. But look, here are the ones. You've had some great conversations with sovereign nations. Very, very informative. Some excellent compatriots you're speaking to. And you see the different people who James has talked to. It's truly incredible. Here's another Bill Walton he spoke with. Of course, you've been with Joe Rogan a couple of times. You've been with Glenn Beck and the Alchemy Symposiums. That's excellent. Again, another sovereign nations. And of course, there's all the other videos that are on New Discourses. And here's one I really enjoy, Allie Beth Stuckey. James, she's a very, very intelligent young lady, and I really enjoyed the conversation you had with her about Christianity.
Yeah, she's
I thought
wonderful.
that was fascinating. Yeah, she really is, and I would have loved to have been a third wheel in that conversation. And I was proud of her for mentioning her Calvinistic roots. But anyway, I want to let me just so there. If you type in, you'll see all of these different videos that James has been part of in these podcasts, and all of the different people that he's been with, and it truly is remarkable. There's one you did with Michael Malice, and you've done some with European entities and Canadians as well. You've really gotten out there in that regard. But let me see if I can just find for a moment where we went. Yeah, here we go. Just watch this a minute, James, then give me a comment.
switch to diversity and inclusion here. Mr. Murphy, numerous studies have found New Jersey schools are among the most segregated in the country. Several years ago, a coalition of education and social justice groups sued the state over this. Your administration has filed motions delaying a ruling in this case. How does that jive with your boast of being a progressive?
Listen, that's the defending is a technicality. That's the obligation of the Attorney General. The Attorney General doesn't have a choice. But the bigger question is, do we accept that the legacy of slavery still exists in our state today? And the answer is overwhelmingly yes. I know we've each been asked about white privilege. We're the most diverse state in America. And if you don't know how to answer the question, it's hard to believe that you could govern the place. And segregation exists, inequities exist. Look at public health, in education, in jobs, in opportunity, in housing. It exists. It's why we just put together a wealth disparity task force. It's why we do things like, it's why we do what the Assemblyman was critical of. It's why we fund those school districts at the level we fund them at. This has been building for 402 years. It's not like a light switch you can turn on or off, but it's a long journey.
That's time, Mr. Murphy. Thank
So James, it's been 400 years. We're still fighting slavery. They don't recognize the great progress that we've made. And the Republican Party is responsible for that in ending slavery in the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. Abraham Lincoln was the first civil rights martyr. He was shot to death because of his position for freeing the slaves and also wanting to give Louisiana black soldiers the right to vote. John Wilkesboro heard it and shot him 2 days later. And yet Phil Murphy says we still have all of these inequities, and he talks about white privilege. And can you believe that the question was asked that he would go in that direction to start naming these fallacies?
Well, he got called out on something, so he had to deflect. That's what this is mostly for. It allows you to carry a shield of virtue while you swing a sword of division, which is completely bogus. Yeah, it's a little bit unfortunate that he, neglected to mention, for example, the 300,000 white Northerners, most of whom were actually racist, who laid down their lives in the Civil War to free black slaves. The debt paid in blood, if you want. So, but he's caught in this corner. He just got called out on something that looked like he wasn't doing racial justice, based on a distortion of what segregation is meant, or what is meant by segregation. The woke have redefined it in a couple of different ways, one of which, and the one that's being referred to here, is the materialist way that school systems, because different neighborhoods and the way that schools are districted, I should say, and how people are assigned to different schools, that school districts end up being de facto segregated, because people who are of certain socioeconomic or even other factors tend to live closer together in similar districts. Those districts are drawn in certain ways. And so you end up with schools that are predominantly poor black, whereas you have other schools that are predominantly rich white, for example. And then they say that this is a form of de facto segregation rather than de jure segregation, and that's still segregation and it still has to be addressed. They simultaneously, however, use the idea that the mere presence of a white supremacist society segregates society as it is, and so thus creating discomfort for people in racial minority groups, and therefore you have to segregate, say, graduations or spaces within the schools, literally segregate classrooms, especially for DEI type lessons. You have to segregate those physically in order to remove the presence of white supremacy from the minority groups that have to experience it constantly. So you have to segregate in order to desegregate, which is obviously Orwell nonsense. That's literal doublespeak. And that's what this is all boiling down to. So, the moderator there cited several studies and obviously Progressive Institute that sued. And to give the guy credit, he's right. That you got called out for saying, we defended it or whatever. And it is the Attorney General's job to do that. It is a technicality. And yes, we do want due process of law. And so at least he nodded in the direction of that. But on the other hand, then he had to go into his moral shield based on, like you said, a ton of fallacies. And the only way to get through those situations and satisfy the Democratic voting base right now is to double down into those fallacies, to repeat them 402 years. This is preposterous. Those amendments you mentioned were 1865. That was a long time ago. And the 402 years refers to the 1619 Project, which is a distortion of American history in and of itself. Claims, in fact, very nonsensically, that the Revolutionary War in 1776 was fought specifically to maintain slavery because the British didn't want it, which is just a complete fabrication. It's just a complete lie.
Revisionism.
Yeah. And so you mentioned historical revisionism. If you go look on, unless they've changed it since last time I looked a month ago, on Wikipedia, and you type in critical race theory and go to the critical race theory entry on Wikipedia, which normally would try to hide this, they tell you openly that historical revisionism is one of the methods of critical race theory, to rewrite history so that people believe the woke Marxist or race Marxist line about it, rather than what they claim. They're trying to claim the mantle of honest history that they teach. They don't teach honest history. They teach Marxist history, which they think is the only honest one. But if you have an honest reckoning with history, you find that what they're claiming is just absolutely preposterous. The founders were divided rather deeply about slavery. Many of them did not want it. Many of them wanted to get rid of it. Some were outright abolitionists. Some were like Thomas Jefferson, who believed it should go away and who struggled through his writing, explaining for decades afterwards how he felt guilt for kicking that can down the road to a future generation, which, like I mentioned earlier, paid in blood. These people, hundreds of thousands of white racists laid down their lives to free slaves. And I mean, these were people who, as men of their time, were very often actually racist, and they still died to free the slaves. And so this is absolutely a preposterous narrative that they've spun. And of course, the justification, or the reason that they're spinning this narrative, is so they can push this agenda of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is literally the installation of socialism under a different name.
Now, James, you give the definitions of each one of these words that most people, if they haven't heard, are going to be very, very surprised. Now, if you could just give us the real definition of what they mean by diversity, inclusion, and equity, each word, and you should be able to see it right there.
Yeah,
coming right from your book.
So I just mentioned the New Discourses bullets thing. The first episode of that is going to be specifically it's 12 minutes, it turns out, episode about these three words. And so I'm going to do equity first. So what I'm saying is I'm fresh on this topic. I'm going to do equity first. Equity means socialism. What is socialism by definition? Socialism is where you have a state that is engaging in an administered forcing of making equal outcomes, right? They have an administered economy, whether social or material, and they're enforcing equal outcomes. They are redistributing wealth, redistributing privilege, redistributing whatever that they've seized to make citizens equal. That's the definition of equity. You can go look it up. The definition of social equity is shares are adjusted so that citizens A and B are made equal. So equity means socialism. Socialism is the objective. That's the goal. There's not really a lot to discuss there. It's just a rebranding of socialism. So what are diversity and inclusion? Diversity means that you have a different perspective. That's what we normally think it means. But what it means within the woke is that all the perspectives are what they say are structurally determined. You have these stratifications in society that we saw from Rob and Dangelo. They structure the fabric of society. And you as an individual live within that structure, and that positions you against those. And so you have what critical race theory calls a unique voice of color, whether you're white, whether you're Black, whether you're Hispanic, whether you're Asian. That is what that structural reality is for you. In other words, when you accept what critical race theory says about being your race, or you accept what queer theory says about being your sexuality, or you accept what gender theory says about being your sex or gender, when you accept these theories, then you have the true expression of your authentic voice. What diversity means for them is that you have different people who have different authentic expressions of their voice. But if you're paying attention, you narrow that down, what you figure out is everybody is a critical theorist. In order to qualify as diverse, you have to look different and be a critical theorist. That's all it means. So what it is the installation of political officers who have the right politics, who might happen to look different. So being an expert in diversity means being a commissar. So if you want to achieve socialism, you need political officers who are going to enforce it, and diversity is the means by which that gets enforced. That's the people who are going to be brought in. So what's inclusion? Inclusion is making sure you accept those people. It's making sure those people don't feel like they don't belong. It's making sure they don't feel excluded. So what excludes these people? Well, anything that reproduces the power dynamic that they exist to call out would make them feel uncomfortable or like they don't belong or like they are excluded. And therefore, you have to censor those things. You can't speak in a way that might offend somebody in a so-called protected class, lest they feel excluded. That's inclusion. But if we look at what happened with Joe Rogan recently, for example, where they released a video of all the times he explained something and the N-word came out of his mouth, and so then they're trying to cancel his show off of Spotify. That means you also have to remove people who remind you of those bad things. So it's not just censorship, it's purges. And like I said with that segregation thing a second ago, it also goes even further in that the mere presence of somebody who represents the power dynamic, a white person, a straight man, whatever, will remind you of the power dynamic. And so you can purge them. But certainly anybody who goes up against the political officer's views is creating a non-inclusive environment. They even at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, they had a rock that they decided represented racism because of a name it got called in 1925 that somebody dug up and told a story about. So they spent $50,000 to remove the rock from campus and said that it made the campus more inclusive. Inclusion means purges and censorship is what it means. Why? So that the political officers can install socialism unopposed. So diversity, equity, and inclusion is the installing of political officers who will not be opposed to achieve socialism. One more word related to this that's not on the screen you'll often hear is belonging. Belonging, by the way, is making sure that the diversity officer or whoever they represent feels like they belong, not just that they're included, but that they belong there, which means in practice, if you are, say, a African-American engineer and you mess up your calculations and somebody else on the team points out that you messed up your calculation, you got this wrong, you might not feel like you belong as an engineer because you made a mistake. And so you don't correct that person's error. Or at its logical extreme, we've all heard the story where, Lenin or Stalin would get up to speak and everybody would stand up to clap. And 10 minutes later, 20 minutes later, everybody would still be clapping because they all knew the first person to stop clapping didn't make the dear leader feel like he belonged, and so he'd be hauled off to the gulag or shot. So taken to its logical conclusion, it means affirmation constantly of the political officers and their representatives and the ideology. So diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging become this installation of Marxism through the political apparatus. That is what people used to call the commissariat or the commissars or the commissary.
Yes.
That's what it is.
What's amazing too, James, is that the word equity traditionally had a legal meaning, and it was made basically a word that would mean wrongs that were made right judiciously, and yet the woke turned it into a euphemism for reparations.
That's right. And this really started, it turns out that the first guy to really talk about social equity theory was a guy named H. George Fredrickson. And he was talking about this even in 1968, as early as that. He worked in the field of public administration, and he said that public administration couldn't just focus on things like efficiency and cost effectiveness. It also had to focus on making wrongs right. And that's where he lays out that it's the adjusting of shares to make citizens equal.
Right.
That's the point of social equity. Now, let me indulge me 1 second here. Social equity stands in relationship to social justice, right? So the idea, if you'll follow me, is that if you enforce social equity through your administration long enough, then maybe you'll get to social justice, right? So social equity is a simulated, forced version of social justice that's not spontaneous yet. But this is a recreation of what Marx believed, is that if you force socialism, eventually it will become natural and spontaneous, at which point you can dissolve the state and you have communism. So social justice actually is just a rebranding of communism. When used in justice and social justice are a broader term. You have to be much more cautious with those. But when it's used by the people who I would call woke Marxists, it's just the rebranding of communism, which is the spontaneous state of equitable affairs that arises after you enforce socialism long enough.
And incidentally, James, you also have another option on New Discourses, the tab at the top for consulting. And a lot of businesses now are being, their employees are being asked to listen to diversity, equity, and inclusion and partake in training. And you're giving consulting services to better equip people in explaining what you just did and what these words really mean.
That's right. I like to sit down with people who are dealing with this and try to give them an understanding so that they might come at it, much more clearly. If you're a company or whatever is trying to make a decision, do you want to install diversity, equity, and inclusion? Well, you should probably understand what you're installing. And so, I can sit down and explain at, whatever length, where this comes from and why it is what it is. So yeah, I want people to understand this across the board.
And you've already mentioned the name of Antonio Gramsci, who is essentially the godfather of Marxism, wouldn't you say, James?
Of cultural Marxism.
And what's important in that, right, cultural Marxism. And the important word that people need to learn is hegemony, cultural hegemony. And the pressure to conform to culture and characterize as common sense maintaining status quo. Then that's an accurate description, isn't it, James?
Yeah, that's right. It's basically the norms, what people expect, the cultural milieu of society, kind of as it is. He characterizes it kind of like a force field that repels revolutionary change. And it's another word for hegemony that gets your cultural hegemony that gets used sometimes now as soft power, kind of in the modern parlance. And so it's these kind of social enforcement mechanisms, where something might not be illegal, but people would frown upon it, that creates a pressure, like it says here, a pressure to conform to what the society expects or believes is right and wrong.
And in a stunning comment, Gramsci knew the pillars of culture, religion, family, education, media, and law protected societies, acting as a force field and must be critiqued and torn down to facilitate revolution. And there you have those pillars that the woke attack. And it was the whole point of cultural Marxism, which would be our religion, our Christianity, our families, our education, media, and law, which is really where it started.
Right. And I really want to just point out, in our world, this was written, in the 1920s. We also must add medicine. They're definitely taking over medicine. Medicine is also a key cultural institution and pillar that we have. And so what Gramsci's idea is that you get inside of these, change them from within. And so basically, if you change the legs of the table, or changing that holds up the table, if you rot them out from within, then the table can fall down. And so that's what he was trying to achieve. Is the other kind of story, I forget who said this, but the termites is an old saying, how deeply they've delved and how well they've dined. If you can picture a wooden table, they get inside and they eat the institution, family, religion, whatever it is, from the inside, and they rot it apart. That thing can't sustain the weight of a culture anymore, and it'll collapse, and then you can have your revolution.
Yeah, it's a great analogy, James, and the first I've heard of that. But just before we go, Gramsci was a great admirer of one Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, and you make an excellent comment that Lenin was Leninism 1.0, Stalin was Leninism 2.0, Mao. We see all of the ideas of Gramsci brought to life with the Cultural Revolution that was instigated and enforced by Mao, inflicted upon the Chinese by Mao. And then woke is Leninism 4.0. So just go through that a moment, if you will. It's talking about the dialectic too, that we're going to be talking about the next time.
Yeah, so Leninism, a lot of times you'll hear people talk about, especially people who lived in China or the Soviet Union, Marxism, Leninism, with a hyphen between them, Marxism, Leninism. And what this is that Lenin developed a new model of revolution for the Marxist ideology, and that's called the vanguard model. Basically, to kind of summarize very briefly, so Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. The Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution led by Lenin was in 1917. So that is a long time for these ideas to have had to percolate before anything happened. And so Lenin came along and said, well, Marxism has the right idea, but the problem is he believes that the working class is going to just wake up and spontaneously form a party and do stuff. And so Gramsci actually did a lot of his writing, specifically because he's an Italian guy. The Italian Workers' Party would not spontaneously organize. It was terrible at it. And so Lenin said, what we actually need is we need people who are technically members of the bourgeoisie, who have had the opportunity to study the Marxist theory deeply. And those people need to seize control and shepherd society through the revolution. And so that was his Bolsheviks, who were going to take the ideology. They were technically bourgeoisie, and they were going to use that they were going to organize the workers for the workers who were too lazy and stupid to do it for themselves, and they would say, caught up in false consciousness or whatever. And so the model is that you have a enlightened vanguard that is going to pull everybody else through the revolution. That's Leninism. So you're going to achieve Marxism by having a bunch of basically aristocrats drag you through it. Stalin, of course, reinvented this. Mao put it into practice in a cultural domain. And so when you have with woke as an entirely new domain where this is happening kind of simultaneously through this kind of identity politics based culture war. But the other thing that people don't understand is in this kind of 4.0 model that I would say is woke is they've also fused with the corporations. They've actually adopted fascism as part of their approach. And so the vanguard of today is actually the corporate vanguard, or literally the bank called Vanguard, or I shouldn't say bank, the asset management firm called Vanguard, these kind of big hedge fund managers or whatever they happen to be. Asset management, BlackRock is another one. Of course, Goldman Sachs, these huge banks behind the corporations have created a vanguard model where they are the ones dragging all of us through this. The corporations aren't going woke because they want to, they're going woke because if they don't, their so-called ESG score will stay low and they can't get their assets invested well, and they can't get investment capital, and they can't get a business loan because they're seen as not likely to be sustainable in environmental, social, and in governance skills. And so what you now have is a corporate vanguard with literally an asset manager called Vanguard kind of at the helm of this, who is implementing a communist style revolution using a evolved, modified version of Leninism or Bolshevism to usher us into a utopian future that's basically based off of the work of people like Antonio Gramsci and Karl Marx.
Yes, and it's remarkable, James. We talked about the use of language, right? And Mao uses the phrase of the great leap forward to substantiate the murdering of tens of millions of Chinese people. He said it was the great leap forward, and he instituted, and you've said in the book that he may not have known about Gramsci, but he certainly did execute his ideas of destroying culture.
That's right. And so, you know, it's really important to understand that the saying in the academic literature is that Mao did what Gramsci thought. So whether or not he knew that the communist circles were kind of coalescing on these ideas at the time anyway. And so he put that cultural revolution into play. And then when we talk about the great leap forward, it's kind of interesting in parallel to what we have happening around us today, the so-called Great Reset. And so with the great leap forward, what Mao claimed to be doing, and you're right, it led to the murder of millions, maybe tens of millions of Chinese. Nobody knows how many. Probably about 30 million, though, is the right number. And he decided that the mark of the highest technology that really would bring China to the forefront of the world is steel production. So the great leap forward was going to be that China was going to become the world's leader in steel production, but he couldn't reproduce bourgeois values. So he kicked most of the steel workers out, and he dragged most of the farmers in to make steel, and he melted their plows and all of this just so they could increase steel production. And the farmers didn't know how to make steel, so they mostly made useless pig iron. And they ended up with lots and lots and lots and lots of useless bad steel and iron, and no plows, no farmers, no food, and millions of people starving to death. And it was a complete catastrophe. The Great Reset is the same thing. Now it's all high tech, it's all computers and synthetic biology and mRNA technology and all of this. but now they have the new technological revolution that shows the way forward to the future, the green energy revolution, et cetera, with the environmental score I just talked about. Then we're going to have a great reset into a new economy where it's going to be the most technologically forward thinking thing. And we're just going to reorganize the economy that's grown up organically in order to achieve it. And you can look back to 1949 when the Great Leap Forward was initiated, and you can just start to think, this is not a good idea. It is really not a good idea. And so, but we're trying to recreate that now, or not we, but the people who are implementing this theory, the people who are working with these asset managers and these ESG metrics to implement this, that are fueling this entire social justice push, are trying to create a great reset where we're going to, again, jump into with both feet blindly sort of this super high-tech world where they envision everything's going to be perfect, and we're going to finally achieve the goals of communist greatness, or fair and equal and sustainable is their buzzword word or world.
And as we finish up on Gramsci, James, this is a remarkable quote. Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. There it is, James, the critical consciousness.
There it is. I mean, what are they doing? That. Why can't your kid read? Because they're teaching them critical consciousness instead of phonics. That's why. Why can't your kid do math? Because they're teaching them critical consciousness in math class instead of math. Why? Because they're going to infiltrate the schools, universities, the churches also. The churches are considered a gigantic opportunity. The woke or the Marxists see churches as the most useful way to basically propagandize those flocks and turn them into communists. It's interesting. The communists in the 30s and 40s were actually creating what they called sucker lists. A lot of people have never heard of this. People they could trick. And they said that the biggest suckers of them all were the progressive Christians. And if they could get inside the churches and they could get the churches to all go along with this, you have the best indoctrination method possible. So schools, universities, churches, and then media, where the propaganda comes from. And the goal isn't to do anything, to build anything, to make anything work. It is to transform the consciousness of society to believe that Marxism will work this time if we just let the vanguard run us through it.
Right, the vanguard are the elites. And what I like to also associate the vanguard with, James, is the slave power prior to the Civil War.
That's right. That's exactly right.
It's no different. The enslavement now is through policy and through economics, and also in government subsidies, taking care of people in the urban communities from cradle to the grave. So these are all elements of the slave power. The vanguard is essentially the same very thing.
That's right.
And now, James, we want to get to Herbert Marcuse's famous essay, Repressive Tolerance, a 4-part series that he gave. And I want to move along because I want to get all of these slides in for our audience. But first of all, let me say this, that reading Repressive Tolerance, and you make mention of this, a lot of your friends and the people you know, it's a very difficult read. It's tough to get through it. But I found, and I would recommend people print out the essay and then listen to James with these 4 episodes and read along with him, and it will open up all of your understanding to precisely what this is. And this is today's newspaper right here. James, you talk about it. This is the ethic of today's woke. It's all there. Everything that we saw transpire with the reaction to the George Floyd murder, it's all there, and or the George Floyd case, if you will. It's all there. So explain to us a little bit. Take some of the highlights from the essays on his essay, Repressive Tolerance, in your 4-part series.
I mean, the thesis statement of the essay is kind of sufficient to get the point across. And I'll give you, a very simple example that you already brought up. And the thesis statement of the essay appears near the end. and as academics like to do, they like to bury the lead. And the thesis statement actually is, and this is paraphrasing very closely to the text itself, is that tolerance must be extended to movements from the left, including if they're violent. Tolerance must be withdrawn from movements from the right, even if they're preventing violence. And so even if they're nonviolent, preventing violence. So the point of censorship, and he says pre-censorship, where you stop the thought from even entering the right-wing person's mind. And so he's very explicit. It means anything that's happening that furthers left-wing, which for him means Marxist goals, must be tolerated by society to have what he calls liberating tolerance. And anything that might hinder that, or that would be considered right-wing, must be repressed in order to create the success of those left-wing goals, which is going to liberate society. So it is a complete intentional biasing of society. It's a tilted playing field. I say on the thing, it says asymmetry is the story. Another way to phrase it is it's not hypocrisy, it is hierarchy. They are telling you that they are your betters and that you have to listen to them and you're always wrong. And so a contemporary example, the one that will resonate, I think, most clearly, but there are a million once you realize it, you'll see it everywhere. But the biggest example was right after George Floyd died, and all of a sudden, COVID policy went away. If you wanted to have a racial justice riot, that was totally allowed under COVID policy. You had Democratic politicians bail, like the vice president currently, who are bailing you out of jail. Yes,
Phil Murphy did a walk with the Black Lives Matter. Came out of Wacken Hut and went off into the parade, totally forgetting about all of the mandates, about 6 feet, about mask, but he had to do it for social justice, is what he said.
That's right, exactly. And so COVID policy was suspended. The actual violence was excused. Representative AOC came out on television and said change is supposed to be uncomfortable. We heard people describing whiteness as property, which is a critical or core tenet of critical race theory. So if they're just burning down a Target, it doesn't matter, because, or looting a Target, it doesn't matter because insurance will pay for it or whatever. And then that must be tolerated. In other words, we must tolerate a movement from the left, even when it's violent, even in the middle of a pandemic. Whereas if you remember, even just a few weeks before that, literally, I think about 2 weeks before that, it was in Michigan. You had a small group, a few hundred right-wing guys, or people, I should say, get together, show up at the state house in Michigan to try to protest the mask mandates, et cetera, in the state of Michigan. And they were called a super spreader event. They were shut down. They were threatened with being arrested. Or if you want to compare it even more poignantly, you compare what happened in the wake of George Floyd's death to what happened in the wake of the January 6th riot. And the comparison, we literally still have people as political prisoners in this country as a result of that. That difference in treatment is repressive tolerance. Movements from the left must be tolerated, including when they're violent. Movements from the right, even if they're preventing violence or nonviolent, must be stamped out so that the thought can't even enter the right-winger's mind. That's Herbert Marcuse's idea. That's repressive tolerance. And that's the world that these leftist Marxists, since 1965, when he wrote this, have forced us to live in.
That's right. You say repressive tolerance is the logic of now. Asymmetry is the story. And that really does put together everything that Marcuse wrote about, James, in this essay has come into complete flourishing.
That's
and
right. They
I
have
also wanted to mention, no, go ahead. I wanted to mention too, James, that I like the figure, the image that you use for these 4 videos. You've got Marcuse in the background, and he reminds me of the Wizard of Oz.
That was the
back
idea.
there behind every, right? I mean, that's the image that comes through with looking at this picture of Marcuse in the back. You think about the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, orchestrating all the events.
Yeah, this is a really my graphic designer did a really great job with that one.
Yeah, you do have a great graphic designer. Give my compliments to that individual, James.
Will do.
And this is what makes the website so inviting. It's really put together so well. Now, I want you to take a moment, James, if you would, to explain to us the analogy that you're using with the red pill and the blue pill for those of us who aren't familiar with the matrix.
Okay,
If you
so
would.
yeah, in the film The Matrix, you have this character Morpheus, who is the guy who you have the protagonist, I should say, Neo, who's the hero of the story. That's got all these special powers and can unmake the Matrix that we're all caught in, this fake world that we're all caught in. And Morpheus is the guy who has the task of finding Neo. And when he finds him, he takes him into this room and he says, "This is really what's going on." Basically sounds like the biggest conspiracy theorist in the universe. And he holds out his hand and he says, "I'm going to give you a choice. So it's your choice." And in one hand, there's like, it looks like a gel cap, like a NyQuil pill or something. And one's red and one's blue. He has these two pills. And he says, if you take the blue pill, you wake up in your bed in the morning, you barely remember this, like nothing ever happened. Do whatever you want with the rest of your life. If you take the red pill, however, you'll see how deep the rabbit hole really goes. And so very iconically, Neo reaches out and you can see it reflected in Morpheus's sunglasses and grabs a red pill. And the next thing you know, he wakes up outside of the Matrix. And so the analogy there is that when you take the red pill, what you're doing is you're saying, I want to see reality as it is. When you take the blue pill, you're saying, no, I want to stay within the fantasy produced by the narrative. And so what you actually have in this case, in this essay, is Marcuse talking quite a lot, kind of in this backwards Marxist sense, about how the society is being administered by the capitalists. And he claims to be offering this red pill, but what we actually realize is that he's offering the blue pill. He's the world that we live in now, the very narrative driven world, the Marxist fake hyper real world, is what he's actually holding out an offer for. And so people, I generally am telling people, and I think I tell people in this essay, like, pay attention. You have to see reality as it is, not through these Marxist lenses. So you have to take the red pill. And so, yeah, that was the framing I did for this episode.
It's an excellent analogy, really put together well. And of course, you've talked about the fact in the third episode in which he's talking about the fact, and you go right through it, and I encourage the people to read it with James as you watch it. In terms of historical function, there is a difference between revolutionary and reactionary violence, between violence practiced by the oppressed and the oppressors. And of course, that's exactly what we saw with the George Floyd riots.
Yeah, I didn't
coming into
exaggerate.
fruition.
He really believes that left-wing violence is justified, and right-wings, not only is right-wing violence not justified, right-wing self-defense is not justified. There's your Kyle Rittenhouse, by the way. He defends himself, becomes, I mean, maybe the courts are going to treat him really well now, but imagine being this kid going through this, 17 years old when it happened, or just turned 18 or something like this. Imagine being this kid going through that, and the trials, the accusations, the defamation, because he defended himself literally in a riot. And of course, the courts found him not guilty of anything inappropriate in the end. But Kyle Rittenhouse is kind of a perfect example. The rioters were engaging in revolutionary violence. And so Kyle Rittenhouse was characterized as engaging in reactionary violence, mischaracterized, I should point out, and dragged through this ordeal, made into a very controversial figure. And so again, you see this Marcusean idea just laid out right in front of our eyes, that we live in this world. And what he's saying is all that violence, all that property damage, even the deaths, there were people burned to death in some of those buildings. All that's justified because it's in the cause of so-called racial justice. On the other hand, defending the tire shop or whatever it was that Kyle Rittenhouse was outside of, that's reactionary violence. You can't even defend yourself. In fact, like I said, you can't even let the idea that you might be able to defend yourself or should defend yourself enter into your mind. That's what he says. And so I really do encourage people this is the kind of key part of the essay, the third part for this series. This is where he gets to the kind of the thesis statement. That's why it's titled Left Good, Right Bad, because that's all this essay boils down to. And like I said, there's this really frightening couple of paragraphs where he actually talks about violence specifically, and it's shocking to read.
It is. There's no question about it. And you talk about it getting very, very dark from that point on, the essay at that particular part. And then finally, the logic of repressive tolerance, the critical theorists as grand inquisitors. Elaborate a little bit on the last episode.
Yeah, in this one, basically, he's tying, this is the end of the essay, and I read through the last part of it, which is actually relatively short compared to the other three. And then I kind of just wrap up and summarize. And what you see is that what Marcuse is saying is that the people who have to be given infinite tolerance of whatever they want to do are people who are under the sway of critical theory or critical Marxism, and everybody else has to be repressed. So in other words, to take to heart what he's advocating for, you have to allow for the neo-Marxist or critical theorist or whatever there's multiple names that all mean the same thing. Whatever that activist group wants to do, you have to tolerate that completely and allow it to happen unopposed. Whereas anybody else who has any kind of criticism or anything has absolutely no standing to say. They shouldn't even be able to think the opposing thought. And so, like I said here, or it says here, it's who gets to be tolerated, who has to be censored, who's allowed to be violent, who's not allowed to be violent. And his answer to that question is himself, and his movement.
Yep, and it's amazing the influence that Marcuse had on the 60s, and subsequently the breakdown of many ways of the family structure. We had more apostasy within the churches, a lot of it led by the young, what we could call useful idiots that Lenin employed. And Marcuse, as you said on the recent Sovereign Nations broadcast, you really accentuated the role that Marcuse has played as being very, very dynamic.
Well, very specifically to that issue, not to drag things out at all, but Marcuse's first major work in English, or actually second major work, his first, I think, book in English is titled, it may be a second, but it's 1955, and it's titled Eros and Civilization. And it is his attempt to mix Marxist theory and Freudian psychology together, but what it's really about is sexual liberation. And so you mentioned the name George Lukács earlier, a Hungarian Marxist, and we'll talk about at some point. But what these guys, these Marxists, Lukács in the 20s and 30s, and then Marcuse understood in the 50s and 60s, was that if you activate that sexual potential, you're going to rip somebody apart from their family and their religion, which are going to be seen as patriarchal and very restrictive and limiting, suppressive and repressive of the sexual freedom. And so they were tapping into that sexual freedom. The whole free love movement was tied into that. And one of its major reasons or rationales from a communist perspective was, in fact, to break down the Christian morality of the United States, to break that cultural pillar into pieces.
James, we see with Woodstock, we see Woodstock as being an example, a clear indication of so many young people getting involved with free love. And of course, drugs became an aspect of the indoctrination of our youth as well. And then subsequently, we had abortion that came a couple of years later after that. So we really saw the fruits of the cultural Marxist indoctrination, the fruits of Herbert Marcuse's philosophy come to fruition by the end of the 60s. Now, I'd like to move on, James, because I want to show the people, we want to discuss your book.
Yeah.
We're going to look at the first 2 chapters of it. And this is very important. And I want to read this for people because this is the reason we're doing this. This is the reason we're getting together. This is the reason James is working so very hard. And we're helping him and working hard on our own to let our citizens know about the critical theory and the disaster that it entails. But the underlying premise, this is James quoting, the underlying premise of this book is simple. We should not attempt to cure what we don't understand. And attempting to cure critical race theory is an obligation of every person in this world who wishes to remain free. Therefore, the purpose of this book is to aid you in understanding critical race theory for what it is, a belief system that can be summarized entirely in 2 words, which are given as the title of this volume, Race Marxism. Quote unquote, James Lindsay. So there you have it, James. The fact is that you can't cure what you don't know. You can't prescribe the prescription unless you know what is the disease.
That's right.
Now,
Yeah, a lot of people
chapter
unfortunately
one
think.
is-
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was
No,
going
go
to just
ahead.
say a lot of people think that critical race theory is just a lot of weird stuff or that it doesn't make any sense, but it has an internal structure and an internal logic. It actually can be comprehended. It doesn't say anything very interesting, but understanding that it actually is just a reproduction of Marxism and thus it's going to lead us into the similar kinds of catastrophes that always does is something
Mhm.
comprehensible. It's not just randomly calling people racists or thinking everything is racist or some silliness like this, or just saying strange academic sounding words like magic spells. Those are things that it does, but it actually has an internal logic as well that's Marxist.
That's right. And for individuals like myself who have studied communism and socialism over the decades, living through the Cold War, if you will, what is remarkable about what you have done is you have introduced us, and cultural Marxism makes up maybe 3/8 of the equation. Cultural Marxism is one, but critical race theory, critical social justice, and all of the different, and postmodernism. And we never took these into consideration, but you brought them out. And chapter one of the book, James, you're talking about defining critical theory. And you're using, of course, sources that are widely known in woke circles and really provide the doctrinal base of the woke movement. And that is a person by the name of Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanchik in the book that they wrote called Critical Theory and Introduction.
Critical race theory and introduction, actually. Yeah. That's a very important book. I think people should read it. They're very clear about what critical race theory is written, it was written in 2001. They tell us it's not, that critical race theory is not in schools, but that book was written on a high school level with classroom exercises at the end of every chapter. So that should tell you somebody's lying.
Yes. There's no question. There are those in education who will ask me, well, show us a school, name a school where critical race theory is being taught. And it's there. It's clearly there. And a book like they wrote is indicative of what is being taught our youth in the schools. I just want to touch on what Brandeis University said before we move on in their glossary on race entry, James. It says critical race theory is a belief system, as you said, a misleading and deceptively appealing classification of human beings created by white people, originally from Europe, which assigns human worth and social status using the white racial identity as the archetype of humanity for the purpose of creating, maintaining privilege, power, and systems of oppression. Brandeis University.
Yeah, that's not what you think the word race means, is it? They have a completely different definition. They share your vocabulary, but not your dictionary. And that is totally nonsense. But you see, like I told you before, the definitions that they use for their words always have the power dynamics that they assume structure society, or the fabric of society, baked into them. So right here, the definition of race is something created by white people. In fact, the definition of it of whiteness is bourgeois property, as Marx had it. And the white racial identity is the archetype of humanity for the purpose, for political dominance, is what they explained. That these people believe that this is really like a gigantic political conspiracy theory to advantage a small number of people over everybody else is literally how everything works, including words.
This is another interesting quote that the audience will be shocked to hear, and that is, quote, unlike traditional civil rights, which embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law.
Yeah, they're not good people.
And not at all. And they look to those of us who believe in these principles of liberal society and equality under the law, equal application, and the Enlightenment rationalism and science, and of course the principles of constitutional law. They just believe that it's inherently racist.
That's correct.
And here we, and the outsider, here's the outsider's definition of critical race theory. James, can you read that? Or do you remember what you put there? Go ahead and read that for us.
It says critical race theory is a revolutionary and broadly neo-Marxist mode of activism based upon the belief that the fundamental organizational principle of society is systemic racism, which it asserts was created and maintained by white people in order to preserve a social structure that provides a multitude of unjust advantages over people of color, especially blacks.
And that's very, very, that's easy to understand. And of course, that picture there is when James was on PragerU, which was long overdue in coming. But we're glad that he got on there because a lot of people watch that video and they're learning. Now, I want to go into chapter 2, and I'd like to touch on each one of these. What critical race theory believes, core tenets of critical race theory. I thought this was fascinating and very important for the people to read and to understand. And I'm going to just show the title, James, and then you just elaborate based on the title, and people can read the fill for themselves. We start with the belief that racism is ordinary and permanent in society.
Yeah, so they actually believe, this is what the point of the 1619 project is they believe that society was created in racism, that there is a stratification, as we heard earlier, by race, where certain people are privileged by the racial dynamic and other people are oppressed by that racial dynamic, and that is actually the way society is organized at its fundamental level. Therefore, it is the ordinary state of affairs in society. And that's I didn't make that up. That's actually a quote from Delgado and Stefanczyk on some page 7 of the book we were just discussing. They say racism is the ordinary state of affairs in society, not an aberration. It's so-called normal science. And so that is a fundamental belief that society is organized structurally by racism that was created by white people as a tool for political dominance. And that has not changed. And the reason it has not changed is because there's not been a Marxist revolution that seeks racial justice as part of its program. And so why is it permanent? Because they think that the system within itself can only reproduce its own mode. You have to have a revolution to break out of the system. Well, the system is racist. So that system that we live in is permanently racist. Doesn't matter that we fought the Civil War. Doesn't matter that we abolished slavery. Doesn't matter that we wrote the 14th Amendment giving equal protection. Doesn't matter that we gave equal suffrage in the 15th. Doesn't matter that we had a civil rights movement. Doesn't matter that we passed all the civil rights and voting rights acts. None of that matters. All that matters is that the logic of the system perpetually reproduces itself, which is a Marxist theory, and that it can only be changed through total revolution. But to make it really clear, you even have a copy of the book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, by Derek Bell, who's considered the father of critical race theory. The subtitle is The Permanence of Racism. The point of this very influential, says the national bestseller, the point of this whole book was in fact to argue that racism within the existing system, American system, particularly for him, American law, is permanent. And only by having a revolution and creating an entirely new system can you possibly have a different situation. You have Dangelo's quote summarizing this ordinary permanent state. She says, we don't have to, within critical race theory, the assumption is that racism is just there. Lawyers would call this petitio principii or something like this. They've assumed what they're trying to prove. The question, she says, and this is a direct quote from her website, the question is not did racism take place, but how did racism manifest in that situation? And I say it's on her website, but it's not on her website once. It's in several of her books, and I've seen clips. It's in talk after talk after talk after talk after talk that she gives. This is a line that she firmly believes in and has been teaching through most of her career, is that it's not did racism take place, because of course it did, because racism is the ordinary state of affairs in society. So the question is, how did it manifest? Because we know it must be there. So if you have two people that you have to, help or whatever, or deal with, one white and one black, if you choose the white person, you did so because you prefer whites over blacks, so you're racist. If you chose the black person first, it's because you wanted to deal with the black person first because you don't trust them and you can trust the white person, so you're a racist. And so how did racism manifest? It's always there.
I've heard you say that quite often early on, just a few years ago, James, that quote, the question under critical race theory is not did racism take place, but how did racism manifest in that situation? They believe in systemic racism. And of course, Derek Bell, James, was 20 years earlier at Harvard as professor, was really created the impetus, especially as far as the legal, saying that the legal system is systemically racist against blacks. And he gained a lot of tread, he gained a lot of mileage by purporting that. And that became evidence to many of the colleges and universities and institutions of higher learning. They believe the same thing. He was very influential. And he was very influential on young Osama. He was very influential on Barack Obama as well.
That's right. Barack
and
Obama
of course,
held him up
here he
as
is,
a
and
mentor.
here's number two. Yes, he did. And there's a video out there of him embracing Derek Bell on YouTube, if you've ever seen that. But anyway, we move to number two, and that's the acceptance of the interest convergence thesis of Derek Bell. Now, what is that, James?
So what Derek Bell said is, he says, well, we look back at stuff like Brown versus Board of Education in particular. We look back at these moments of racial progress. We look back at the Civil Rights Acts or even abolition. And what you find is that there's always some other ulterior motive. The white people involved did not help out black people because it was the right thing to do. They did so because they had some converging interest of their own. So they had interests that converged, and that's the only time that white people will do the right thing, as he said. So they're not really doing the right thing because they're being selfish. And so, for example, specifically when he talks about Brown versus Board of Education, he says, well, at the time, this was 1954, if I'm not mistaken, the communists were pushing out massive amounts of propaganda saying that communism is anti-racist. Look how racist and segregated America is. So the USSR obviously has the right model, and the West is all backwards and racist, and we don't have any race problems. Workers of the world unite. Everybody's the same. And so he said, well, that was not good for the white people in power. We had this communist propaganda. So how are they going to defeat the communist propaganda? Well, it was in their best interest to desegregate schools to defeat the communist propaganda. So it was nothing about helping black education. It was, or black people are overcoming racism. It was actually the interest in defeating communism that really motivated them, which is, in my opinion, a strange example to have trotted out as the real reason that we desegregated schools, was so that communism might not advance as far. So maybe he wanted communism, I don't know for sure. But at any rate, that's the idea behind the interest convergence thesis. Now, a weird consequence of that is they demand that you be, and this is in their, they don't say this quite explicitly, but there are books about it. They demand that you become anti-racist on their terms, and then you do, and you're an ally. And then they say, well, you only became an anti-racist and an ally because it makes you into the good kind of white person who's not racist anymore and doesn't have to keep being an activist. So it was in the only reason you actually became an anti-racist was because it was in your own self-interest. So people would stop calling you racist. So you actually become a racist anti-racist, but you never stop being racist, according to this. So this is a kind of other application of the interest convergence thesis. So by adopting the anti-racism that they say that you must, you're actually proving that you're racist and doing a racist thing. And there's papers and books about this. There's a book by Shannon Sullivan called Good White People. Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility actually touches on this a lot too, where the whole point is that white people try to position themselves as anti-racist or not racist so that they can feel like they're good people. But in fact, they're really just serving their own selfish interests. They're not trying to do actual racial justice advocacy. And why? The interest convergence thesis. They're only doing it in convergence of their own interests, not for the right reasons.
Yeah, and it's quite hopeless an idea, James, that there's nothing that you can do. It's hopeless. Anything that you would do for those who may have been treated unfairly
Yeah.
throughout life. There's
It's also
nothing that you can do.
Yeah, it's also a paranoid conspiracy theory.
Yeah, no question about that. And we want to talk about here the belief in material determinism. That's another point. So flesh this out, James. Would you like to read it, or would you like me to read it?
I mean, I can read it if you want.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So it says belief in material determinism by racial category. Actually, my thing is in the way, one word. I'm sorry. Material determinism is an old Marxist idea that material conditions determine the choices people make, including moral and intellectual choices. In other words, noble ideals like the content of one's character cannot truly be used as a basis for judging people because the material conditions they themselves live in and the consciousness regarding those conditions ultimately determine their character. As a consequence, material determinism implies that one's choices are at least partially deterministic on one's range of outcomes in life, as assessed by Marxian theory. And so this is a Marxist idea that your position within the class hierarchy or the material conditions you live in gives you your consciousness. It gives you the range of ideas that you're actually able to understand and express. So if you're in the privileged position, then you like your privilege and you become willfully ignorant to anything that will threaten your privilege. And if you're oppressed, you've been fed the ideology, this is just the way it is, go rely on God, whatever it happens to be, so that you don't rise up. So you've been conditioned to accept the conditions of your bondage, if you will. And so you are, as a result of the conditions you find yourself in, your character, your range of thoughts, your values, the ideas you have about the world, your total subjective range, really, in Marxist theory, has been determined by the conditions that you live in. And so your moral character is actually a consequence of your class standing. So with critical race theory specifically, they would talk about how redlining and these kinds of, especially economic and legal structures in the past have made it so that Black people have to, that they see the world a particular way, that their character has actually been shaped by segregation, redlining, even slavery in the past. And the material, sometimes we hear that they're the echoes of slavery or the echoes of segregation and Jim Crow or the legacy of slavery. Those material legacies shape your character, which is why you'll see people say occasionally you'll have some politician, probably a Democrat, screw up and there'll be some robbery or something and a Black person will do it and they'll say, well, they can't help it, they don't know better, something like that, because they were raised up. But this mentality actually is pervasive within this line of thought, and that the mentality is that if you grow up in poor conditions or bad material conditions, you don't know how to be a decent person. And so you are made into a bad person by your conditions, which is why you'll also find politicians saying that we could stop crime, for example, by paying criminals not to kill. If you just fix their material conditions, then they wouldn't be criminals. And it turns out that this completely misunderstands the nature of crime and human nature and humanity and individuals, more or less completely. So that's what material determinism is, though.
That's right, James. And we see that today with in many aspects, especially with some of the prosecutors throughout the country, and the Democratic Party essentially looks at criminals as victims rather than actual criminals.
That's right. They're victims of their circumstances. And therefore, when they get arrested, you just let them back out. And the next thing you know, they've committed another crime. And you do this again and again. And your Soros DA will just keep using this bad idea to repeatedly do it again and again.
Right. All part of the subversion of our society in that regard, and our structure of law and order.
That's right.
Social construction, James, and the imposition of race.
Right. So social construction basically is very simple. That they believe that the racial categories are fictions. They have nothing to do with underlying biology. I think in most respects, they're probably right. Although if you can see somebody who looks different, obviously something's different. What they primarily mean is, determining in terms of somebody's character, but a social construction actually has a deeper meaning. This is where structuralism and construction kind of come together. And the idea is, like Marx had, that there was a superstructure of society that has the access to the good stuff, and then an infrastructure of society that does all the productive work, and that those two are in relationship with one another and create a dialectical relationship, he would say, and they create a structure of society. And that's with race, they say, well, these where we saw the definition of race earlier, that race is a creation by white people, a categorization created by white people in order to maintain their dominance. That's what they mean by the social construction of race. They mean that it's a fiction that has a political purpose, and it was constructed by people in power to maintain their power. And so they believe that race was socially constructed. But unlike the postmodernists who said, well, if something's socially constructed, we can just deconstruct it. We can just make it seem absurd. It's just a social fiction. And even the kind of, the liberals in the, yellow flag or even Republican Party sense, not in the left wing sense, the liberals generally have this idea too. We're going to treat people equally under the law. We're going to consider them, as unique individuals created in the image of God or whatever, as we see in the Declaration of Independence, not worded exactly that way, but that's the idea behind it. And so there's this deconstruction.
Nature's God.
That's right. So there's a deconstruction of the social idea of race. Well, what we have here with the social construction is that it's understanding it in a Marxist way, that the power dynamic creates it, and therefore you have the idea that it also imposes the power dynamic itself, and the people in charge of it impose that social construction of race on people. So what critical race theory says is white people have the privilege of not having to think about race because they've given themselves that privilege, but they impose blackness or brownness on other races and make them think, oh, you're Asian, oh, you're black, oh, this, and that means something. And so race is imposed upon all the races except white, which causes them to have to deal with race and to have actual consequences of that political social construction that they created, as we heard already from their definition, for their own benefit.
Then we move forward and we have the belief in structural determinism by racial category. What is that, James?
So it's the same thing as material determinism, where your material conditions determine who you actually are, with a range of what you can understand, how you think about the world. But now it's your social position instead of your material position. So we have this social construction of race, and that social construction of race determines the full range of who you happen to be, what your character will be, how you see the world. And so it's the exact same thing we talked about now, but now it's not talking about material conditions, it's talking about structural social conditions as they imagine them in the identity Marxist theory. So it's exactly the same thing we just talked about. Your character is determined by who you are because of the power dynamic, for whether it's structural racism and critical race theory, whether it's heteronormativity within the queer theory or whatever else.
And what you say too, quoting, the structural determinism roughly holds that structural conditions which are defined by systemic power become the basis for one's lived reality in life, thus one's character, values, attitudes, and views. Structural determinism therefore holds that the structural conditions of the organization of society, including what is considered knowledge, how language is used, norms, expectations, customs, demographics, facts, etc., creates group level rate outcomes in a statistically deterministic way, while also leading people have particular views associated with their positional relationship to systemic power. Basically robs the person of their individuality, right?
That's
James?
right. That's right. So you are actually a member of your group, or as George Lukács, the Marxist, explained it, that you can't understand a part except in its relationship to the whole. So the natural whole is in a class stratified society, the class. So you can only understand who you actually are in terms of your class identity, where your class identity in critical race theory is your racial identity. So your character, who you are, is determined by which racial group you're in and how that's regarded according to the so-called white supremacist racism that structures society. So group identity becomes more relevant than individual identity. You don't have any individual agency any longer. You are an avatar of your identity group because you've been determined in that regard by the power dynamics. And so if you say what critical race theorists say, and we'll hear this in the next slide probably, then you're speaking correctly about that. But if you disagree with them, then you're just being inauthentic, because the critical race theorists have already figured out what it's supposed to say, what your character is, what your values are according to that position.
Right, James, I want to touch on this, the other quote that's provided here on the slide, because I think it's very important. Would you like to read that? Can you see that? Okay.
Yeah. The acceptance of the doctrine of structural determinism also explains critical race theory's commitment to what it refers to as critical social justice, which considers individual rights less interesting and important than group rights, and which seeks to create, quote, justice in the world by equalizing on average group outcomes, plus making up for historical injustices, so that means reparations, under the brand name of equity. Group identity is therefore infinitely more relevant than individual identity, and a person's authenticity as a member of a racial group, so for example, as a white person, as a Black person, which you'll hear them say very frequently. So a person's authenticity as a member of a racial group can be determined by the degree to which they are capable of speaking as a member of that group, according to how critical race theory characterizes its experience. This is why Black people who are against critical race theory are race traitors or acting white, and why Asians, Jews, and many Latinos are white adjacent, despite not being white.
Yeah, it's a very important point there, Jason. Of course, we've already touched on the idea of equity and reparations, but again, it's robbing the person of their individuality. All that matters is what group you're a part of, and that's how you're recognized.
And you'll notice that they use that as a marker of authority. They'll stand up and say something in front of a crowd. Well, as a Black man, I think blah, blah, blah.
Mhm.
But then they'll say what that means is, as a Black person, I experience racism, yada, yada, yada. As a man, however, I am in a position of relative privilege to women, and therefore I have to shut up and listen. And this is engaging this positional, they call it positionality, engaging positionality. It's saying, I know where I am in the power dynamics and how they affect me. And in fact, what that unique special information that I get from that I can impart to you, or where I have to relegate myself to the role of a learner instead of a speaker.
Yeah. And we continue with this fascinating chapter 2. And then we have a unique voice of color, positional standpoint epistemology. And there was I included an essay that was written by Catherine Hernois. Have you read that, James? Race, Gender, and the Black Woman's Standpoint?
I have not. I bet I can guess what it says.
Yeah, I think you'll like that one. Yeah, yeah, but I think you'll like that. Add that to your repertoire, but just give us a brief description of what you mean by unique voice of color.
Yeah, so what I was kind of leading into that with what we just talked about on the previous slide. And what it is that if you have an authentic experience of being your racial category or your sex or your gender or whatever, then there's a correct way to speak to that. There's a correct way to explain what that is. And what they say is that this gives you a unique voice of color, which is a position of authority to speak from. So you say, as a Black man, I experience racism, therefore I can say blah, blah, blah about racism, and people can't challenge me. But the thing is that voice of color is also, there's a correct way, in essence, to be Black. Because if we look at Larry Elder, for example, who ran for governor as a conservative in California in the recall election last year, he's Black, and the LA Times put out an article saying he was the Black face of white supremacy. And the reason they said that was because he's a conservative. And specifically, that means he wasn't saying what critical race theory says a Black person should say. And he wasn't authentically representing the Black person's lived experience. So his voice of color was being silenced, and instead he was upholding white supremacy. So what it says is that if you repeat critical race theory and you happen to be of a particular racial group, then you are speaking from your unique voice of color and are therefore authoritative. So you see this paper, Race, Gender, and the Black Woman's Standpoint. The idea is that Black women, in this case, have a very unique position from which they can speak. They know what it's like to be Black. They know what it's like to be a woman. They also know what it's like to be marginalized as Black women specifically. with very specific stereotypes. So they can tell us all kinds of stuff about racism and sexism and all of the ways that they interact intersectionally and so on. And so what it boils down to in practice, though, is that people who have, it doesn't even have to be, I was going to say particular identity factors, but it doesn't matter. People who spout off critical theory are speaking authentically according to their racial position, and therefore they are authorities on that. If they happen to be in some person of color category or Black or something like this, then we have to listen to them. Whereas if you are not, then you have to listen. We have to listen to them. And if you don't have those, then you don't, your story has been told, and we don't have to hear you out. And so the unique voice of color is a very powerful doctrine within critical race theory. And like I said, it boils down to saying that there's a right way or wrong way to be whatever race you are, white, Black, doesn't matter. And it is that you are saying what critical race theory says you should be saying about your experience as a person in that race.
Right. Regardless of what race you are, you have to be critically conscious.
That's right. That's right. It's just Marxism. The Marxists were the only people who, according to Marxists, who have the true understanding of society and history and of social relations, and therefore everybody else was plagued by bourgeois values and couldn't be listened to. It's just a reproduction of that in a new domain.
Right. And then we have storytelling, narrative weaving, and counter storytelling. And just let me read a portion of the book quoting Critical Race Theory, an introduction from Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanchik. Stories can be destructive to the existing order, is how you preface it. And then the quote says, quote, some of the critical storytellers believe that stories also have a valid destructive function. Society constructs the social world through a series of tacit agreements, metadated by images, pictures, tales, and scripts. Much of what we believe is ridiculous, self-serving, or cruel, but not perceived to be so at the time. Attacking embedded preconceptions that marginalize others of conceal their humanity is a legitimate function of all fiction. So it doesn't matter whether you're telling the truth or not to get the point across, James.
Correct. And in fact, it's really, really, really crazy how they use storytelling. But this is, for example, where you would hear after the Black Lives Matter eruption after George Floyd died, and then people started to critically, in the real sense of critical, scientifically really examine, well, what are the statistics? How many Black people, unarmed Blacks, are actually being killed by police officers every year? How does that stack up to others? What if you control for these factors? What if you do a rigorous analysis? And then you would hear people occasionally say, well, it doesn't matter what the statistics are. What matters is it feels like to us that this is happening every day. And
we heard that a lot.
That's right. And it feels like Black people are being murdered in the street by police every single day. It turns out there were like less than 20 over the course of the year of 2019, which means just as a mathematician, just to speak frankly, there's 365 days in a year, 19 or 20 or whatever is a lot less than that. And so by the pigeonhole principle, that's a bunch of BS. That doesn't work. And so what we have in this situation then is that they believe that they can tell these stories and to enter, the chapter in Delgado and Stefanchik literally is storytelling in law. You go into the courtroom and you tell these stories in order to evoke emotional responses that they call destructive of, the existing tacit agreements and preconceived notions. So you tell these evocative stories. And it's really shocking. Like you think, okay, I kind of get that. And you tell these emotional stories and you pull people off of their reason. If we wanted to get kind of Greek and religious about it, you take people out of the logos and into the pathos as a persuasive technique. I get that. But if you actually read their literature, like sometimes they just make stuff up. Like they just make stuff up. And I give some long examples. Derek Bell was famous for doing this. He would pretend to have letter exchanges with people, sometimes that didn't even exist. And then he would use those as these stories that he was, these completely fictional creations he was writing as, evidence of what racism is like. And this is absolutely preposterous. It's shocking to read it. Like some of these stories are legitimately like delusional. stories that he would write, these fake email exchange or letter exchanges he would have with people. The stories that he would tell are just utterly crazy. The one of them, if I recall correctly, was that if we invented a pill that could stop crime, right? All you do is you take this pill and you never commit a crime again. You become a model upstanding citizen. Very quickly, he said, we would distribute these pills very quickly. Everybody would say, this is great. There's no crime. Everybody's flourishing. The people who used to be criminals are doing great. They're not in jail. They're contributing to society. Everything's getting better. And then he says, well, the police and the courts and all the people who profit off of crime would realize the pills are putting them out of business. And rather than celebrating this, they would run a police raid and find out where the pills are being made and seize them all and destroy them, because they would want to keep making money off of the criminal justice system. And it's like, that's a paranoid delusion. And it's not even just a story. That's a completely nonsense story that like a third grader would write. Like, that's ridiculous. And this is what he holds up. This is the true nature of how racism works in our society. And it's like, this is really crazy. I mean, I mean that in the clinical sense. It is a crazy person that would do something like this. And this is the kind of stuff that critical race theory relies upon. And again, Derek Bell, this is one example. Derek Bell's books are filled with these things.
When you say too that the use of fiction in this regard would be an example of the postmodern thought of the lack of objectivity, and rather the emphasis placed on the subjectivity of the person and the relativity of with the person. Truth is in the eyes of the beholder, if you will.
You'll definitely see that with the later critical race theorists. Derek Bell was not actually postmodern almost at all, especially when he was writing those things in the late 70s and early 80s. Maybe when he gets into the 90s and he started writing more of these stories. But yeah, the postmodern theme, though, that there's no real distinguishing feature between fact and fiction. As a matter of fact, what you find is that the postmodernists characterize things like facts and science. They characterize that as stories white people tell themselves, or straight white men tell themselves, about why their knowledge is better than other people's knowledge. And so it's all just a bunch of fake stories, science, evidence, doing the statistical analysis. That's all fake. It's all politics by other means. It's stories, let's do a statistical analysis and find out, well, that's just a story by another means. That's a story using math, which is a story white people tell themselves about getting better answers about the world. But it's really just something that white people created in order to maintain their power over society, because those statistics don't support the critical race theory narrative. And so by the time you get into the 90s, critical race theory has actually taken a hard turn into this kind of nonsense. And yes, the postmodern influence becomes more and more pronounced as you go forward from there.
Then we move on, and we've already discussed this a little bit tonight, James, and that's historical revisionism. And of course, we know revisionism has to do again with subjectivity, not being accurate with fact. And that's another part of the belief of the critical race theorists.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. If you actually listen to the creators of the 1619 Project, who are a little bit more articulate, they'll tell you that the point of, I mean, even Nicole Hannah-Jones.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get her two names that are first names mixed up sometimes. She's not particularly relevant character on my radar. She said that the point of this was never to write particularly history, but it was to tell a story about history that reframes things in a different way, which is exactly the storytelling we just heard about. So it leads into this. But the point is, what the more articulate voices would say is that they're creating historiographies, which are stories about history. So there might be historical facts, but it doesn't matter what the facts are, because it matters how you string them together in a story. But if you read the 1619 Project and its claims about the Revolutionary War, for example, and a few other things, it doesn't appear to matter what the facts are at all either. You can just tell the story in order to try to reframe history. And so historical revisionism, you'll hear them try to defend this as, oh, well, we're always trying to get history right. We're trying to go back. We have to rewrite where we find new facts and get things wrong. So historical revisionism is a standard practice. No, this is nonsense. They're doing historical storytelling. They're reframing the stories of history to selectively leave out facts or make up things or tell them in the wrong order or whatever it is in order to convey a narrative that basically forwards that, again, emotion driven or pathos driven persuasion technique to create a narrative. 1619 Project is to say that America was founded in 1619 as a slaveocracy, as a nation born in slavery, not 1620 when the Jonestown colony was established, but 1619
Right.
when the first boat came over that happened to have a slave or two, but I think they're actually indentured servants, but facts are loose on the ground here, or thin on the ground here.
Right.
It doesn't really matter. They're fudging these things to tell this story. And the point is, well, if we can just think of America as being 400-year project, like your governor said, of
Yes.
slavery, a 402-year project, I guess, of slavery, then nothing has actually changed. And so you can hear how this historical revisionism, it's not just some abstract academic baloney, and it's not just something that unfortunately they're teaching to kids and shouldn't be. The governor repeated it in a debate.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's an attempt to reframe the meaning through story of the entire history of a nation or the Western world or a religion or whatever else. You'll see they do the same thing, trying to reframe the story of the gospel. So they're trying to do historical revisionism on the story of Jesus, to reframe Jesus as a critical race theorist and a socialist or something. And I mean, you'd think I'm kidding, but no, really, genuinely.
Right. It's true. And the other thing that Governor Murphy said too, James, which tied in, which you've already mentioned, and we can talk about with the historical revisionism, is he mentioned the legacy of slavery, quote unquote, that he still says is an issue today in New Jersey, only in they're making it such, which of course is part of the critical theory, and to break down truth.
That's exactly right.
Not recognizing. And he said they clearly said it as well as with the 402-year reference to the 1619 project. And I just want to read this last, I think this is an excellent quote you write in the book. You said the real rationale behind their application of historical revisionism is that in the praxis of critical race theory, every subject must be bent to the purpose of raising a racial critical consciousness, which is to say, manipulating people into becoming critical race theorists. James, Lindsay.
That's right.
Which is precisely what, right?
It's really sad.
And
I mean,
of
it's
course,
really sad how many people have taken this up. Every time, if you actually were to study critical race theory and kind of take it at its worth, it's kind of telling you every time we start thinking of Black people as a class, something bad happens, and for Black people. But if you look at actual American history, which they want to bury, when we start treating anybody as individuals, including Black people, what you find is that, of course, certain individuals rise very well. It's when you start thinking of them as a class that you're trying to, say, administer to with a Great Society program or whatever, all these kind of ham-fisted educational reforms or all these other things, that's when you start screwing people over. And it is really not in anybody's benefit to be thought of as a class, because the individuality, and thus what motivates people to act as individuals and to better themselves and to better their communities around them in a kind of voluntary fashion, goes away. And so it is the thinking in terms of these classes that's actually the disaster. Collectivism is a disaster. Recognize people as individuals, and you give them the first, it's not the only tool necessary, but you give them the first tool necessary to start making something out of their lives, which will then raise those statistical averages that they're talking about. It's the class thinking that's trapping people. And it's really sad then that your governor is repeating that and using this kind of historical revisionism and these other critical race theory things. Like I said, I can't accuse him of being a critical race theorist. Critical race theorists and Marxists in general are very good at getting so-called suckers and useful idiots to repeat their ideas for them so that they look fashionable in front of an audience. They're very good at getting people to do that. I don't know what the motivations of your governor are, but I do know that I heard him with his own mouth say these things, that these things are unconscionable for anybody in the United States to espouse if they understand the way that the United States works, and if they understand why the U.S. Constitution is uniquely in opposition to Marxism. And it's just a total tragedy to see whether if he's adopted it, that's terrible. And if he's just mouthing it, because he's cynical, that's terrible. And if he's mouthing it because he doesn't know, that's also terrible. There's no positive reason. There's no excuse. And so hopefully he can be informed and he would change his mind, but being that he's a Democrat, he is trapped and probably can't. And so that's grounds for a strong push, in my view, in New Jersey, that this guy needs to be out because he's going to harm the people he's standing up there claiming to speak for more than anybody else.
That's right. And he has a very close relationship with the Institute of Social Justice, which is located in Newark. And of course, they are essentially, they're all critical social justice warriors, all of them.
I'm telling you, if you see
interesting
that
is, James,
Institute for Social Justice, you should translate it. Institute for Communism. That's what it is.
Yes, that's exactly right. And we're going to attempt to bring you to New Jersey later on this summer and hopefully have a discussion on a panel that we're trying to put together that we would sponsor, as well as the James Madison Institute and our great friend, Dr. Robert George. We're going to be working on that, James. We'd love to have you come to New Jersey. And I just want to say before we move on to the next slide is that, the Constitution is the protector of the individual, whereas Marxism is the destruction of the individual.
That's right.
And that's something that we have to remember, and we have to revere our Constitution and make the Constitution relevant again. That's what we talk about all the time here, making it preeminent again, as opposed to looking to personalities and looking to representatives. We look to the Constitution and we evaluate those representatives on their faithfulness to the Constitution, because the Constitution is what protects our natural rights.
Exactly.
Okay, we're going to move on now to a critique of liberalism. And we've already touched on this a little bit. And here that's a good segue in talking about what we were talking about with the Constitution, James, but just to give us a little bit of insight on a critique of liberalism, which is what they specialize in.
I mean, critical race theory, we already heard that quote from critical race theory in introduction, which you see on the screen, where they say that they call into question the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, which means rule of law, enlightenment rationalism, which is reason and science and evidence, and neutral principles of constitutional law, which we are a constitutional republic. So if you're calling into question the idea that there's going to be neutral application of the constitutional law, you've got a big problem going on. So what these critical race theorists, et cetera, see is that they believe that, and I could read this to you straight out of that book from Robin Dangelo that we looked at earlier. They see that liberal societies fool people in the underclass into believing that they have opportunities and freedoms and resources that they don't really have. So really, liberalism is a conspiracy to hold the underclass down and to keep the upper class up. The idea that people would be individuals, or that they'd be free, or that they would have equal treatment under the law. What that does is for them reproduces the problems of the existing society. So it's extremely anti-liberal. This is the biggest mistake I hear conservatives make consistently, is when they talk about these woke people, they say liberals this, liberals that. And I get it. It's an Americanism and it's wrong. These people are leftists. And I think we should be cautious with the language on this, not to be a pedantic guy about language. I'm not a semantic pedant, but Ben Shapiro has a wonderful book he wrote last year. And in that book, he points out that we have a massive number of conservatives and a massive number of liberals in this country who are actually on the same page about leftism. Right now, partly because of this language abuse, most of the liberals, your genuine American Constitution supporting left-wing people, are siding with the leftists, with the woke, with the Marxists, because they see the conservatives as their enemy rather than their natural ally. Leftism is the enemy. And critical race theory is not a liberal ideology. It is a leftist ideology, just like Leninism, just like Stalinism, just like Marxism, just like Maoism. It is the attempt to seize power and total control through a leftist ideology. Liberalism is freedom, equality, legal reasoning, rule of law, things like that. We're all, created equal and endowed by our creator with inalienable rights. Our rights come first. Our treatment as individuals comes first. That's liberalism, and critical race theory rejects that entirely. You think in terms of the class, racial class, economic class, sex class, gender class, fat status class, whatever it is. Critical race theory is for racial class. You are a racial collective that's in class struggle, one class against another. And that is not at all how liberalism frames the world. And for liberalism, we are all we have something we all share in common, universal humanity, or we could say in a religious frame that we were created in the image of God and are image bearers of God as unique individuals. That's the religious framing. The liberal, secular framing is that we all share humanity in common. So we'll treat each other as equals in our humanity. And then secondly, we're all, not just do we have this in common, we're each individuals in and of ourselves. And so we have to protect individual rights, including the rights to life, liberty, and property. I like the Jeffersonian pursuit of happiness, but the Lockean property cuts to the bone a little closer. And that's what liberalism's about. And the critical race theorists do not want you to have your rights to life, liberty, and property. They don't want you to have rights at all. In fact, in this book that you see on the screen on page 23, it says it right here. Rights are said to be alienating. Critical race theorists are highly suspicious of another liberal mainstay, namely rights. They do not believe in rights. They believe in privileges. So that's why they use that word. The special people in society have privilege because the society is granting them special privileges and not others. They don't see the world in terms of rights. They see the world in terms of privileges granted by a state. And this is a fundamental difference and rejection of liberalism. It is a leftist totalitarian ideology. Repressive tolerance that we spoke about earlier is a totalitarian document. Our side gets to have all the say and cannot be opposed, even if we're violent, and you're not even allowed to think otherwise, is repressive tolerance. This is an anti-liberal, anti-freedom, anti-constitutional document and ideology and theory, if you even can call it a theory.
It truly is remarkable, too, when we talk about, and we'll talk about this the next time, about the dialectic, Hegel's dialectic. And what amazes me is that the dialectic they even apply to the two ideals of freedom and liberty. That is right. A dialectic in its, or excuse me, justice.
Freedom and justice.
Freedom and justice. That is remarkable that they apply the dialectic understanding to those two terminologies. To me, that is remarkable. And you see that right. with that's the objective of the Institute of Social Justice. And exactly. Organizations like that. There is a dialectic there. We'll talk about that with Hegel. The whiteness as property. Harvard Law Review article by Cheryl I. Harris in 1993. How is it possible to associate white people with property, James?
Well, the idea is that if you read this article, which is long, it's like 90 pages long, it's very detailed. She says that property has certain, it's funny to say this, has certain properties to it. You know, you can exclude people in particular, the fundamental right to exclude, she calls it. So I have my property, this is my book, and you can't have my book. I can exclude you from my property because it's my property. This is my home, and you need to be excluded from my home or I'm going to shoot you, you know, or something like that, right? That is a fundamental right that we can put in terms of property rights. And she goes through these kind of 4 or 5 basic, I think it's 4 things that characterize what makes something a form of property, private property. And then she says, well, whiteness was created by white people to grant themselves special privileges in society, voting, the ability to vote, which was excluded from other people originally, et cetera. And they get to also decide who's white and who's not white, right? So originally Irish people were not considered white when they came to the United States. And according to critical race theory and introduction, there was a deal made with the Democratic Party that they told the Irish, if you vote Democrat, we'll make you white and we won't, you know, racially discriminate against Irish people anymore. I mean, that's really what it says in the book. I don't actually know that.
True.
Yeah. So what it actually
Especially
is,
in New York.
What she's saying, though, is that there's a form of racial property called whiteness that allows people to be in the upper echelon of society that they can exclude everybody else from, which means it's what Marx described as bourgeois property. It is capital. Whiteness is a form of cultural capital, is what she's actually saying. Capital being a special kind of property. For Marx, capital is a kind of property that you can use to make more of itself. Capital can beget more capital because it's property that you can invest back into a capital generating process.
Mhm.
And so she's framing whiteness out as that. And so when we have it on the screen, the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx in the second chapter and Friedrich Engels say that the communism can be summarized in a single sentence, which is the abolition of private property, which is why we see once you characterize whiteness as a form of bourgeois private property that white people gave to themselves. We heard that definition of race earlier. They created race so that they could characterize themselves as the dominant race. They gave themselves a property status that allows them to be the superiors in society. When you characterize it as that, you can then say critical race theory can be summarized in a single sentence: abolition of whiteness. Then when you look at Robin Dangelo saying that there's no such thing as a positive white identity and the aspiration is to be less white, you see that echoed by Coca-Cola in their diversity training that got called out last year, that the goal is to be less white. You see that the goal is, and you actually will hear them occasionally in their materials say that the goal is the abolition of whiteness. They're just reproducing Marx. And this woman, Cheryl Harris, in 1993 wrote the article trying to explain how whiteness functions as a form of property that has everything that goes with property rights usually, but it's something that it's a legal fiction that white people produced for themselves, gave to themselves, and used to exclude everybody else from the top layer of society, the upper strata of society.
It's amazing, James, that people like Cheryl Harris, and I would even say Derek Bell. What's remarkable is that, maybe some of the other contemporary Black advocates of critical race theory and critical social justice, they have a hatred for white people, and they really do think of white people as being a group, as opposed to evaluating a white person as an individual. And it really is remarkable the hatred that they have, and they instigate it with others. They want others to partake with them in that same hatred for white people.
It's a perfect reproduction of Marx's and hatred of the wealthy who weren't paying his bills for him, if you know anything about his life story, and that he tried to induce in the proletariat to hate the upper class as well. So yeah, it's very unfortunate. It's poisonous. It is a hate-based ideology. It does not live up to the idea of judging people by the content of their character, because we already heard your content of your character is racially determined for you. So you have to judge people by the color of their skin, and privilege is what's causing all the problems. So access to whiteness is causing all the problems. So you have to abolish that. It's just Marxist hate repackaged in a racial box.
And James, if there was a Mount Rushmore for critical race theory heroes, Kimberly Crenshaw would definitely have her place up there. Tell us why, and what is intersectionality?
So Kimberly Crenshaw actually named critical race theory. She said we were critical theorists, in case anybody doubts that they were of the Herbert Marcuse neo-Marxist line. She says we were critical theorists who were interested in racial justice, and we were racial justice advocates who were doing critical theory. So the name was a natural fit, critical race theory. So that's where it got its name. She also invented the concept of intersectionality, which is basically the Marxist belief that all forms of oppression are naturally interlinked, and you can't understand one without understanding the relationship to all the others. So she named that in a 1989 law review paper, and then she fleshed it out in another law review paper called Mapping the Margins in 1991, where she says explicitly that we have to lean into our identity categories. We have to see ourselves as Black or as white or as Black women specifically. And she says that, if what she was doing was looking at the time, she was looking at the way that the feminist movement would often put race issues second to have women's solidarity. And then she would look at the Black nationalist movement and the way they treated women, and then would often put feminist type issues second because they were trying to focus on race issues. And she said, well, here we are as Black women, as Black feminists, getting doubly marginalized. Neither of these movements represent us. We need to have something different. And so what she's actually pointing out is that class-based thinking is a failure. And her solution is we need to have even more class-based thinking and create this complicated web of the way that the classes interact so that we can kind of cobble them together into a big solidarity movement that has its own internal hierarchy that pretends it doesn't. And so intersectionality becomes crucial to critical race theory, because you can't have a critical theory of race that doesn't recognize that half of the Black people are Black women that have their own special characteristics, and half, some proportion of them are lesbians that have their own special characteristics, and so on and so forth. And so it's really kind of a way to continue to it's a way to, how do I put this right, to take these different movements like feminism or Black nationalism or whatever and bring them to heel under a single umbrella that happened to be headed up by queer Black feminists. And specifically, these were all, I don't know if Kimberly Crenshaw, I don't think she is, but many of the Black feminists were forming these ideas in the 70s and early 80s were socialist.
Kumbaya River Project.
The Combahee River Collective, yeah, they were Black lesbian feminist socialists, and they're quite explicit in that. They explicitly say, our project is Karl Marx's. We completely embrace it, but we have to put identity factors like race and sex, et cetera, first. They're more important than race, and so that's where Kimberly Crenshaw's relevance comes in. That's what intersectionality is. It's the idea that you have to think of all of the identity categories and the very Marxist analysis of all of them all at once, and constantly think about identity as central to how you're going to understand your position of oppression, and do kind of this very complicated Marxism that can never quite be pinned down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting, the intersectionality part. And we've got I believe we've got two more, and then we're done, so. James. So talk to us. Let's talk about anti-racism as praxis. Of course, praxis means combining the advocacy with the philosophy, correct?
That's right. Praxis means that you're putting the philosophy into practice, and then you look at what happened and reinterpret it in terms of the philosophy again, and kind of an endless wheel of circular thinking. And so for critical race theory, being an anti-racist is the practice that they want you to put in, the theoretically derived practice. And so anti-racism becomes the Marxist praxis. Now, if you recall, we talked about critical theory earlier with Horkheimer. He said that a critical theory isn't a critical theory unless it has an ideal vision of society, critiques the existing society for failing to live up to it, and inspires social activism in order to transform it. Which is to say, it reproduces Marx's idea that the point is not to understand society, but to change it. And so you have to be putting this stuff into action. And so what we see with anti-racism is there's kind of two major veins. One is the Robin Dangelo vein, where it's this kind of quite literally, very religious, spiritual, inner transformation quest you're supposed to be on to become more and more anti-racist, to abolish your own whiteness, to become less white. And then Ibram Kendi's is very practical. This is all about policy, which is going to include your internal personal policy, our policy in between one another, social norms. He even explains in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, that policy is kind of a catch-all term that means sort of everything and how it works and how things do, not just public policy. But for him, what anti-racism as praxis means is enforcing equal outcomes, enforcing equity. And that's where you see in the middle there is 2019 Politico magazine, How Do We Fix Inequality piece. He explains very, very clearly, we need a Department of Anti-Racism powered by a constitutional amendment that makes racial inequity, so differences in outcomes on average by group, unconstitutional. And it would have the power, he says, to pre-clear all local, state, and federal public policy, to evaluate all private policy, like in corporations, to monitor public and private officials for utterances of racism or when inequity surfaces, and then empowered with disciplinary tools to make them change their ideas and policies. In other words, it's a dictatorship of the anti-racists. which is exactly
No question.
parallel to Marx's dictatorship of the proletariat. The awakened anti-racists who are putting into praxis the critical race theory are the same as the proletariat who's putting into praxis the class consciousness that Marx was trying to induce. So they're going to take and form a dictatorship after they seize the means of cultural production or control, and then they're going to be in charge of all policy at all levels, etc. So for Kendi, it actually means intentionally discriminating so that you get equal outcomes. And that's what you have to do to force a race socialist state until it becomes spontaneous and becomes justice. And that's where he says, you have this quote from his book on page 19, the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. So we're talking literally, he's calling for discrimination. And if you recall, in the 2020 general election, California had a ballot measure to remove its anti-discrimination language from its state constitution. Well, why on earth would they do that? Because the only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. So you have to bring discrimination in. So for Kendi, anti-racism as praxis is discrimination by a dictatorship of critical race theorists. And that's a nightmare. But for them, that is the duty of conscience, if you will, as it's phrased in kind of some of the legal literature. That's the duty of conscience that their faith commands them to have. You must force equal outcomes until they're spontaneous.
It's amazing. And this gets back to repressive tolerance. You talked about Marcuse, and now we have Kendi. It's amazing that the very thing that they want to accomplish, or the very thing that they want to eradicate, they are essentially, in essence, what they want to eradicate, which is totalitarianism, fascism. Of course, Marcuse was motivated by the specter of another Hitler. And of course, Kendi wants to eliminate discrimination, but yet he says to go ahead and that discrimination should be a remedy for instituting communism and critical race thinking.
Right. What Kendi doesn't want, he says that he doesn't want there to be a discriminatory world, but what he means is that he wants to implement discrimination to make equal outcomes and to continue to do that until that just happens by itself, till you don't need to enforce it. In other words, we all listen to Kendi and think that he sounds like he's probably not a very smart man, which is probably true, but he's reproduced the dictatorship of the proletariat Marxist idea and the enforcement of socialism until it becomes spontaneous, literally exactly with this set of ideas.
As we finish up chapter 2 of your book, Race Marxism, we look at critical whiteness studies. This is Patricia Biddle, who you mentioned in the chapter. First, to describe racism as prejudice plus power. And critical whiteness studies, of course, is not doesn't look upon white people very favorably.
That's right. So the goal with critical whiteness studies, all the way back to, I don't know how to actually say Patricia's last name, but it's spelled Bidol.
Biddle.
Yeah, Biddle or Bidle or Bidol. I have no idea. Anyway, she wrote the first book in 1970 on this issue. And then that kind of expanded into a series of other books. Her 1973 rewrite of that was a manual paid for by the NEA, the National Education Association, the teachers union, and was distributed by them in 1973. It's called Racism in Education, I think. I'd have to double check the citation on that. And then in 1978.
Important point, James.
Yes,
that's an important point.
The teachers unions have been doing this for 50 years. And then the first kind of really clear book on this was by Judith Katz in 1978 from Oklahoma University, University of Oklahoma, I should say, titled White Awareness. And this has turned into, you can tell when you read, say, Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, that she was applying the programs laid out by Bidol and by Judith Katz, and people were not liking it in their occupational settings. So she came up with White Fragility to explain why people didn't like being called racist according to these definitions. But the idea is that white people have a race too. and it's not being imposed upon them by society. So they have to be made aware. Hence that whole kind of discussion. How do we get to the title white awareness, which is what they wanted to raise. White people need to be made aware of themselves as a racial class, and in particular as the bourgeois racial class, so that they will be awakened and will start to take steps to dismantle whiteness from within, which is, again, it's a reproduction of the Bolshevik ideology. And so when we get to, by the time we get to 2010 and we have books like Being White, Being Good by Barbara Applebaum, you can see, she's very, very clear about what critical whiteness studies is about. That's probably white complicity, white moral responsibility, and social justice pedagogy is probably the clearest expression of the critical whiteness approach, unless we read maybe, a couple other authors who've written some papers. She says the white complicity claim maintains that all whites, by virtue of systemic white privilege that is inseparable from white ways of being, are implicated in the production and reproduction of systemic racial injustice. And the relevant point for now is that all white people are racist, or complicit by virtue of benefiting from privileges that are not something they can voluntarily renounce. So what it is to convince white people that they are in the bourgeois position in society, that they reproduce the structure of racism for their own benefit, that they're morally complicit in all the harms that has, and thus they're responsible to take on a Marxist view of abolishing their own social position that they have allegedly illegitimately given themselves as a form of special property. So it's really a poisonous ideology. You can see that this is, it's quite clear. The book is I think the title is correct. It's Race Marxism. It's very clear that it's a reproduction of Marxism.
Yes.
And you can see this just piece after piece after piece after piece after piece. You see all the different pieces of Marx's sprawling ideology, or Lenin's application of it, reproduced in critical race theory, tied up in a new civil rights looking, it's like in a box shaped like civil rights, but it's actually the opposite.
And I remember, James, about a year ago, you said that we should call this neo-Marxism. The neo-Marxism is the proper identification, but I think it's much more accurate to refer to this as race Marxism.
Yeah, I do too. I'm improving as I learn more.
Yeah, well, you put a lot of effort into it, and I also noticed the similarity between critical theory and introduction and race Marxism. The covers, was that done deliberately, or of course, I think it's a great cover.
Yeah,
it gets the people's attention. Seeing the,
there are
hammer and sickle.
There are a few reasons. It wasn't actually to parallel to that specific book, but I will point out something very interesting about that book and another book. I chose that partly because the color, the bold red, really gets people's attention. The hammer and sickle because it's communism. Of course, this also reproduces the National Bolshevism flag. So people can look that up and see the parallels, especially when you start to read the folkish nationalist parts in chapter 3 and 4. That it gets into, that it's also reproducing. But speaking of critical race theory and introduction, but more importantly, there's another book I cite repeatedly and quote from repeatedly called Critical Race Theory, The Key Writings That Form the Movement, which is kind of the major I wish I had a copy. I don't have a print copy. I only have a digital copy of that book. I would hold it up for you. It is a big, thick, 500-600 page, large red book, solid red. And I would bet you that critical race theory and introduction is solid red for the same reason, because the inside joke I recently learned about a month and a half ago, the inside joke when they hold up critical race theory, the key writings that form the movement, which I said is a large red book, is that they kind of wink and call it the big red book, alluding to Mao Zedong's little red book. So Mao had his little red book. They have their big red book. And so I chose the red because of red communism and to make it really stand out to people, and because it echoes the National Bolshevism flag. And they chose the red because it's communism, at least in terms of the big red book. I don't know for sure with Delgado and Stefanchik and the critical race theory and introduction, but I would not be the least bit surprised to find out that they were subtly signaling that as well.
Who wrote the big red book?
So the Big Red Book is a collection of these kind of law review articles and chapters out of other books.
Oh, okay.
So a lot of
Yeah.
people would have, but Kimberly Crenshaw was the primary editor. It had 4 editors. Kimberly Crenshaw and Neil Gotunda are the 2 that I can remember off the top of my head. Both of whom were there at the founding conference of critical race theory, even if you haven't heard of them. But Kimberly Crenshaw is the primary editor of the book, and several of her works are in the book. Many of Derek Bell's are. Mary Matsuda's are also present there. And it, like I said, it's, I don't know how many pages, 500, 600, 700 pages. It's a huge book. And all of these kind of, Cheryl Harris's Whiteness as Property is in there in full, all 90 pages of it. Kimberly Crenshaw's 60 something page paper is in there, a couple of them. And so Kimberly Crenshaw is the chief editor of that. But the book is sort of a who's who of critical race theorists.
Yeah, I'd like to get a copy of that book.
I would strongly
Now,
recommend actually that people get a copy if they can and read, whether they read any of the essays or chapters or whatever or not, read the introduction, which is a day-long read. It is a very long, very difficult introduction, but it'll tell you virtually everything you need to know about critical race theory.
Well, James, what we wanted to do tonight was to provide a survey of the New Discourses, your website, all of the podcasts. We wanted to put some illustration to the names that we hear you mention quite often, give a face to the name, to the book titles. And that's why we decided we wanted to do a PowerPoint presentation. And we're just under 3 hours now, so we're moving into your Hegelian podcast timeframe. But I certainly appreciate your time. I know you're very busy, and I would like to, in a month or so, we'll get back together and do part 2 and finish up, because we didn't even talk about Marx. We didn't talk about Lukács. We didn't talk about postmodernity as much as I want to, but I want to do the last 2 chapters in the book and do some more of the podcasts that you put out, especially the Hegelian, which is one of my favorites. But I really appreciate your time, and I hope you enjoyed the PowerPoint presentation as well.
Yeah, it was good. Thank you. I hope this has a big impact in the state of New Jersey and beyond. So thank you.
Well, I think it will. We'll be going to the Leadership Summit. We'll be talking about you and this event tonight that we had. And I wanted to ask you 2 personal questions, if you will, just as a friendly aside. How many people tweet you a day, do you think? How many people actually tweet you?
40, 50,000 probably. I don't know.
Is that right? That's amazing. That's amazing. And yeah. I consider myself privileged that you would even give me an answer.
Well, yeah, it's a lot. In my direct messages where, we've communicated to set this up, I probably get somewhere between 800 and 1,500 direct messages a day most days.
That's amazing. And you go through them. Well, James, the other thing I wanted to ask you is, are you still practicing martial arts?
I am actually.
Good.
Not as much as I would like, and not as often with my instructor as I could before COVID, since my instructor lives in Beijing and going to China is virtually impossible. But I'm keeping up with my practice. I did a pretty good workout with it yesterday, as a matter of fact, that I'm still feeling as I'm sitting here right now. So I am still training, and yeah, I don't think I'm going to put that away.
Well, that's good news, James. But it's good to know you're doing that, because you have to have a balance. You're working so hard intellectually and reading, and this is tough reading, what you're doing with the critical theory books. They're very difficult. And we really appreciate you reading Repressive Tolerance. I thought that was outstanding. But I want to thank you, James, and for all the great work that you do. Keep it up. We have great fans here in New Jersey and amongst the New Jersey Constitutional Republicans. So we hope to see you again, and all the best.
Likewise.
And as we say goodbye, let's remember what Lincoln said. He said, liberty to all. And that meant everyone, regardless of who they were and what color they were. Thank you, James. Take care.
You too.